Okay, Council, I believe we have everybody here. I think so. Okay. Okay, Council, I'm just waiting for a thumbs up and we will be ready to go. Okay, good evening, Council. This is the City Council study session, 6:30 p.m. Tuesday, the 14th of September. And first thing up is our call to order. Lita?
Mayor Karen Moran.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Christy Mauchow. I guess her mic's not.
And she's present.
Yeah. Councilmember Ken Gamblin. Microphone.
I didn't see his microphone come on.
Councilmember Gamblin, are you online?
Yeah, I see his icon. Councilmember Tom Odell.
His didn't come off mute either.
No.
Ask him if they can unmute.
Can council unmute themselves? Are they not hearing me?
Try again. Try checking somebody else and see if we can hear him.
Councilmember Chris Ross.
Yeah, we're having problems with the...
Oh.
Yeah, we're working on...
Log off and log back onto the meeting.
Really?
That's what you're going to have to do.
Well, there's a setting here.
Can you hear me if I'm speaking?
You're muted.
Okay.
Technical difficulties.
From City Hall.
See everyone, but she's calling roll, but you're not answering us. So Rich is helping her with it right now. So please. Rich said, please stand by a minute. Because I had to go on here and unmute myself for you to hear, the volume isn't coming out. I can hear myself here at City Hall, but you're not hearing us, so he's gonna restart the meeting.
I don't know.
Hey, go ahead and close the meeting, Lita.
Okay. So end.
Yep.
No?
You just ended it for everybody.
Isn't that what you wanted?
No, I just wanted you to.
Oh,
to
dear.
is
For
there any way
myself?
yeah, is there any way we can get in touch with them to tell them that they, and actually this might be good though, go ahead and get yourself logged back on.
So do not remember my name for future meetings. Do not connect to audio. I think
You
I,
gotta enter the meeting ID.
oh no. Oh, shoot.
Like it through your email.
On all public and
Here.
Councilmember Tom Odell,
Here.
Councilmember Chris Ross,
Present.
Councilmember Pam Stewart,
Here.
Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're off and going. Meeting accessibility. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-28, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual city council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and public comment is able to be submitted. The city is now using Zoom webinar to host its public meetings. To join the Zoom webinar on the web, https://zoom.us/I/N or 977-434-76957. By telephone, dial 253-215-8782 and enter the following webinar ID when prompted: 977-4347-6957#. To view live the city website, www.sammamish.us/TV21, or YouTube, and Comcast Channel 21 within Sammamish only. To view later, meeting videos are available the day after the meeting. Again, the city website, www.sammamish.us/TV21, on YouTube, and Comcast Channel 21 within Sammamish only. Pledge of Allegiance. Deputy Mayor, would you like to lead us in the pledge?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Pledge allegiance
To the flag
Flag
of the United States of
United
America,
States,
and to the
and
republic
to the
for which
republic
it stands,
for which it stands,
one nation, under
one
God,
nation,
indivisible,
God,
with liberty and justice for all.
Liberty and justice for all.
The first thing I'd like to do this evening is we would like to have a moment of silence. We will pause for a moment of silence to remember and reflect on those who lost their lives, those who stepped up to serve, and the countless sacrifices made by many in the 20 years since September 11, 2001. During our observance, we will show a video taken at sunrise on 9/11 at Sammamish City Hall. Thank you. That was actually quite beautiful, and I think there's a lot of us who can remember exactly what we were doing on 9/11 of 2001. Next up, we have the approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Do I have a second? Great. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of approval of the agenda, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. Okay, next up we have proclamations, and we have two proclamations this evening. First is the emergency preparedness. Councilmember Ross, do you have that in front of you?
No, I don't. I was trying to pull it up, so skip over me, please.
Okay. And then the second one is National Recovery Month. And so, Councilmember Gamblin, do you have the emergency preparedness?
Yes, I do.
Okay, could you please read the emergency preparedness proclamation?
Sure. Emergency Preparedness Month, September of 2021. Whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of individual, family, and business readiness and community resiliency. And whereas Emergency Preparedness Month creates an important opportunity for every resident of Sammamish to prepare their homes, businesses, and communities for any type of emergency, including natural and human-caused disasters. And whereas investing in the preparedness of ourselves, our families, businesses, and communities can reduce fatalities and economic devastation in our community. And whereas the City of Sammamish, private businesses, volunteer agencies are working to increase public activities in preparing for emergencies and to educate individuals on how to take action. And whereas emergency preparedness is the responsibility of every citizen of Sammamish, and all citizens are urged to make preparedness a priority and work together as a team to ensure that individuals, families, and communities are prepared for disasters and emergencies of any type. And whereas all citizens of Sammamish are encouraged to participate in citizen preparedness activities, such as making and practicing emergency plans, having 2 weeks of emergency supplies, and participating in Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, training offered by the City of Sammamish. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Mayor Karen Moran and the Sammamish City Council do hereby announce and proclaim September 2021 as Emergency Preparedness Month and encourage all citizens and businesses to develop their own emergency preparedness plans and work together toward creating a more disaster resilient society. Signed this 14th day of September 2021 by Mayor Karen Moran.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, we have got the proclamation for the National Recovery Month. And Deputy Mayor, would you like to read that one?
Karen, if I can have someone else read it.
Oh, yes, never mind. You sound a little bit hoarse. How about Councilmember Stewart?
Sorry, there we go. Just let me get to that really quickly. National Recovery Month 2021. Whereas behavioral health is an essential part of one's overall health and wellness, and whereas prevention of mental and substance use disorders works, treatment is effective, and recovery is possible, and whereas recovery is a process, and that people recover in our local area and around the nation, and whereas preventing and overcoming mental and substance use disorders is essential to achieving healthy lifestyles, both physically and emotionally. And whereas an estimated 400,000 people in King County are affected by these conditions. And whereas we must encourage relatives and friends of people with mental and or substance use disorders to implement preventive measures, recognize the signs of a problem, and guide those in need to appropriate treatment and recovery support services. And whereas we recognize 4 dimensions of recovery from mental health and substance use disorders: health, home, purpose, and community. And whereas to help more people achieve sustained long-term recovery, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, King County, and Washington State invite all residents of the city of Sammamish to participate in National Recovery Month. Therefore, the Sammamish City Council does hereby proclaim the month of September 2021 as National Recovery Month.
Thank you. And I know we have a lot of people that suffer from many of these things. So, all right, next up, we have got our discussions for executive session tonight. So the first one up is development regulation updates. And with this, we will have David Pyle, Evan Fisher, and Jeff Arango.
That's correct, Mayor. Good evening, David Pyle, City of Sammamish Department of Community Development. I'm here tonight with the Development Regulations Phase 2 project team to provide you an overview of the project and initiate council discussions regarding the list of code amendments that we're proposing, and also discussions on a unified development code. I'll turn it over to Jeff Arango with Framework Consultant. He's a consultant, the lead consultant on the project, supporting our work in this effort. Jeff?
Great, thank you, David. Appreciate it. Let me just put this into full screen here. Okay, good evening, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Jeff Arango, and I am the Director of Planning and Framework, and we're the lead consultant for the Development Regulations Phase 2 updates. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Leslie Bain, Principal Urban Designer with Framework, and Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio, who's the sub-consultant on the project and leading the Unified Development Code. The agenda for this evening, we're going to give an overview of the project purpose and need, as well as the planning process. We'll then go into the neighborhood design standards, highlight some of the code analysis that we did early in the project to inform the development of standards. We'll go through the design principles, the design standards, then provide an overview of some new site design criteria, clearing and grading improvements, development review process improvements, and finally, the Unified Development Code. So the project purpose and need. The primary objective of this project is to better align the comprehensive plan vision in the community with development outcomes, and ultimately to improve the quality of development that's occurring in Sammamish and maintain and enhance the character. One of the things that we did early in the project was a survey, which is shown in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. This was one of the questions that asked residents or respondents to rate the impact of new residential development on the character of existing Sammamish neighborhoods. It was a relatively small sample size, but out of 112 responses, about 87 or so of them rated it somewhat worse than before or much worse than before. So there seems to be dissatisfaction with the quality of development that's occurring within the community, and again, a disconnect between what the comprehensive plan vision says here and some of the key words that are highlighted. Talks about well-preserved natural environment, kid-safe culture, unrivaled connectedness, both physically and socially, tree canopy, peaceful neighborhoods, multimodal transportation, affordability, and sustainable housing, to name a few. The other purpose I wanted to highlight is the creation of a unified development code. So as you know, the city is still using King County, remnants of King County code that were in place before the city became incorporated. And so this process will combine many of the titles that are in the current municipal code into one title, which will be the Unified Development Code for the city. It'll have a consistent look and feel, consistent formatting, updated graphics, and style, which I'll show later in the presentation. Okay, David?
Great, thank you, Jeff. Some of you may recall, or I hope you all recall, some of you may have served on the council at this time. The city council directed city staff in September of 2018 to take on development regulations phase 1. This was in result to concern around outcomes in development. And we consider it as a heavy lift where we made some coarser changes to the development regulations to achieve better outcomes. As part of development regs phase 1, we took on density rounding, we took on setbacks, building height, mass grading, fence heights, parking, street frontage, and critical areas work permit exemptions and when a permit is required. This project wrapped up in May of 2019 with the passing of Ordinance 2019-482. Next slide. Density rounding, if you recall, changed how partial units of density were rounded for different project types, and it added a requirement that units earned through rounding are affordable duplex units. With regard to setbacks, we changed designation of setbacks from street and interior to front, side, and rear, and we created 3 categories for setbacks: general setbacks for all structures, unique setbacks for primary detached dwellings, such as single-family residences, and unique setbacks for detached accessory dwelling units. And it is important to point out that Sammamish has and retains some of the most flexible regulations for detached accessory dwelling units, which is an area of opportunity in the city for us to provide diversity in housing choices. However, we're not seeing very many of them being built. We as staff are constantly analyzing that, and we will likely have a conversation about that here with this project. We also added a method to reduce side and rear setbacks with neighbor agreement when adjacent parcels are under different ownership. Next slide. With regard to building height, we changed the method of building height measurement from average finished grade to average existing grade. We limited facade height to 40 feet with exceptions. We added an 18-foot height restriction for standalone detached accessory dwelling units. With regard to mass grading, we added a prohibition on mass grading with restrictions on excavation and fill. We added exceptions and deviations allowing for exceedance of the limits under limited circumstances and when justified. We added a restriction prohibiting speculative clearing before construction permits are issued. All of these changes were really important in how we manage construction. Next slide. We also took on fence heights, where we added an allowance for fences up to 8 feet, limited to 32 feet in length along any setback line with an agreement from the neighbor and with the building permit. We also addressed parking, where we added a requirement that one additional parking space be provided for each new lot created through the subdivision process. We added clarifying language regarding where the parking must be located with a priority hierarchy. Next slide. We added a requirement that all new lots created through subdivision must have a presence on a private or public street through 30 feet of street frontage, and that could be averaged, but we added flexibility allowing averaging of street frontage across a project with a minimum of 20 feet and a cumulative average of 30 feet. We also added a prohibition on work in critical areas without first obtaining a permit. We also refined the exceptions associated with that. One thing I want to point out here that I think is important for us all to keep in mind is that although we made these changes in 2019, we have not seen many of these changes actually hit the ground in construction yet. As we've talked about before, it's important to keep in mind that a short subdivision or a subdivision can have a shelf life of 12 to 14 years. And you might find that some of the rules that we've had in the past are still being built, or some of the projects that were vested to rules of the past are still being built today. And that may continue on for several more years, as these rules were just put in place in 2019. And we did have several subdivision projects on the books that were vested, that were in some point in process or some point under construction. So So I think that's a really important point to remind the public about, is that although this council is making changes to our development regulations, that there are projects that are vested or grandfathered under state law, under subdivision law, that may continue to be built under older regulations. So if you do hear the question of, I thought we changed that rule, well, we likely did change the rule. However, that project that you're seeing built is vested in accordance with state law. It's not the city's doing, it's state law that provides that vesting to subdivisions. Jeff. Oh, the next slide. Apologies. So I also wanted to provide an overview of the process that we used for phase 2. It was budgeted in the city's 2019-2020 budget. It's consultant supported. It included an online community survey. We researched code examples and best practices. We've met with master builders now twice. It included 3 meetings with public works staff to review the amendments, receive input, and make sure that they're not in conflict with public works standards. There's been multiple reviews by city staff internally to look for conflicts. The process initially started with the formation of a community advisory group. And with that group, we did initially vet the problem statements and look at potential solutions. That led to Planning Commission's review of code language that was drafted in response to solutions identified by the community advisory group. And ultimately, this has led now to this meeting with the city council, where we're daylighting this to the council and talking about it with you. Next slide. Just as an overview, to date, there have been 4 community advisory group meetings, starting back in September of 2020 and ending in January of 2021. There have been 8 planning commission meetings, starting in March of 2021 and concluding with a public hearing in July of 2021. And there are 5 city council meetings that are planned on this topic. The first is tonight, and this topic is scheduled to wrap up by the end of the year, hopefully with the new regulations that the council chooses to adopt in place on January 1, 2022. Next slide. Jeff.
Great. Thank you, David. So as I said earlier, early in the project, we did some code analysis to try to unpack what are the major drivers of the development patterns that are occurring in Sammamish. One of the questions I think that was fresh in our minds was, why are you getting in Sammamish typically very large homes on relatively small lots? I think that was one of the questions we were trying to answer. And we know that the city has some open space requirements or recreation space of 390 square feet per unit. And that open space or recreation space can count towards your density, which then allows you to reduce the lot size. And many communities have a minimum lot size. In Sammamish, there is no minimum lot size. So up to date, it's been sort of up to the developer and the designer to propose, how large the lots are, how much open space is being preserved and for what purpose. And there really is a lack of, I think, criteria around the decision-making for that. So we took, in this table down here, we took the R4, the R6, and the R8 zones. And I'll just start with the top one. If you're in the R4 zone, you're dealing with typically a quarter-acre lot, which is about 10,890 square feet, which is quite large. You don't see many lots being built today in Sammamish at that size. Once you take out the open space requirement of 390 square feet, you end up with an average parcel size of 10,500 square feet, so quite large. However, what we're seeing being developed in the R4 and the R6 zone in particular are typically, 5,000 to 6,000 square foot lots with a 4,000+ square foot home on it. And the reason that they're able to do that is because there is no minimum lot size, and essentially they can set aside open space and use that open space to count towards the density. And what this does is, one, it preserves some open space, which could be a very good thing. but it also reduces the infrastructure cost associated with building roads because you have smaller parcel sizes and more compact development. And these are things that typically, many communities will often promote, but in Sammamish, it's being done really, again, without much criteria or much say from the city. And so what we found is regardless of the R4 zone or the R6 or the R8, you're getting very similar development patterns in terms of the size of the parcel relative to the size of the home, which is one of the issues we've heard quite a bit about from the public engagement process. So we looked at several development examples in Sammamish. This is a diagram of the Highcroft, which is in the R6 zone. And here you can see what I just described. Even though it's an R6 zone where you might have, almost a 7,000 square foot lot at the base size, you have lots that are in the 4,000 to 5,000 square foot range. And you can see that the white boxes on the individual lots fill out most of the lot. So it's quite large homes with very small lots, and they're able to do that because there's no minimum lot size, and they can sort of determine how much of this green space gets provided. The other issue here is that you have the backs of these homes here abutting right onto a major arterial. Not only that, but you also have the topography issue as well. And so one of the things that we're looking to do in the neighborhood design is think more holistically about how and why we would want to see open space preserved and where it would be provided. So for example, in this diagram, forgetting the fact that there's some topography issues and there may be some constraints on these green areas here, if we were able to locate some of that open space, say along the buffer, along the arterial and provide a buffer, that I think would start to enhance and maintain the wooded sort of character of Sammamish. And so those are the types of things that we're looking to address in the design standards, which I'll go through in a moment. In terms of the right-of-way here, there's intermittent on-street parking and travel lanes and wide planter strips and sidewalks. We think generally, that looks pretty good. The landscaping, will take some time to grow in. So it is a little sparse right now, but I think over time that will start to mature and have a pretty nice streetscape up there. This is another example. This is in the R4 zone. This is actually a planned unit development that was approved, I believe, under King County Code prior to incorporation. It's called the Laurels. It's on Southeast 24th Street. There are a number of qualities we like about this development, and there are also a number of qualities that the Planning Commission had some concerns about, which I'll highlight in a moment. But here, as opposed to the Highcroft example, you see that they've located their stormwater facility and some open space along the arterial. So you have this nice buffer. They've also co-located their open space or recreation space there along the frontage. Because they're providing this extra open space, I'm assuming they were able to shrink the lots down. And so you have relatively small lots and I'd say relatively small homes. They are about 2,000 to 2,500 square feet. The Planning Commission did not particularly like how close the homes were together and some of the compactness of it. But that is often one of the trade-offs in a planned unit development that you get in exchange for these wooded buffers and some of the other amenities. And these are some of the concepts we're exploring in the planned unit development code, which was part of our scope. But the Planning Commission recommended that that be brought up again in phase 3, and they be given some more time to consider what that should look like. And then in terms of the streetscape there, they don't have the planter buffer, which isn't quite as nice as the other example, but they do have pretty narrow 10-foot travel lanes, and it does allow for some intermittent parking and some really nice mature landscape. This is an older development, but you can see on this diagram down below, there's really nice placement of trees that kind of make even small spaces feel kind of private. Many of the homes have deep, narrow driveways so that the parking can be sort of set back a little bit from the face of the house, which we like. Not every home is designed that way, but several are. Then we went and looked at individual sites within each of the zones. And this is an example, I believe, from the tree farm. This was a development that several people brought up in the community advisory group process as a development that they really liked. I think they liked the larger lots and sort of the more breathing room, but also the really wooded character, kind of the rural by design aesthetic. It's got a very nice forested buffer along the arterials, so the homes are have a sense of privacy. But this is in the R1 zone where the lots are much larger, and you know, we're dealing with a number of different zones that allow for more dense development. But in terms of the sort of character and aesthetics, people really liked this example here. You can see that the driveway doesn't overwhelm the frontage. There's decent side yard setbacks and kind of a feeling of open space, and there's quite a bit of architectural variety in the homes there. And this is a metric you're going to hear me talk about a lot over the next several minutes, and that's floor to area ratio. And that is the size or the square footage of the home to the size of the lot. And you can see this one is at 0.25, which means that the square footage in the home is about a quarter of the size of the lot. And you'll see some examples where that number creeps up almost to 1. And we'll show you what that looks like spatially.
Hey, real quick on that one, is
Yeah.
the lot size really only 2,100 square feet, or should that be 21,000?
Yeah,
If
that
it's
is.
an R1, that
Yeah,
seems
that.
like it's off by an order of magnitude.
Yeah, that is a mistake. That is, well, you can see it's 110 by 110, so it's a little over 10,000. Apologies for that.
No worries, just trying to check my math. Thanks.
Yeah, no, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. So here, yeah, it's roughly 12,000 square foot lot. We had it correct up here. I think we transposed the 2 and the 1. And you can see the lot coverage is
Before we go on, can I ask one question too?
Yes, please.
And that is the floor to area ratio. Is that simply the first floor, or is it the first floor plus any others?
It's first floor plus any others. So it would include the second story as well.
And potentially third story.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Yep, it would not include a basement, at least the way that we're defining it. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment, because it's essentially can be a control on the bulk and scale of the development. Good questions. Here's an R8 example. Again, much more dense in terms of what's allowed under the code, but you can see it's almost a 4,500 square foot home on a, let's see, on a 4,400 square foot lot. And you can see that floor to area ratio is now about 0.75. You can see there's very narrow setbacks. The driveway, even though it's not particularly wide, takes up most of the frontage of the lot. And I think these are some of the conditions that the community has concerns about. Again, the size of the lot relative to the size of the home. This is another R6 example, and you can see it's very similar. The lot is a little bit wider, but you have a 30-foot driveway here, which again takes up a good portion of the frontage. It's almost 5,000 square foot house. And a floor to area ratio of 0.7. So even though it's R6 versus R8, you're getting a very similar development outcome. And again, that's partially because of the ability to set aside land as open space and count it towards your project density. Another thing we looked at are the dynamic setbacks that the city put in place in phase 1. We just wanted to understand sort of their impact on the size of the building or the home relative to the size of the lot. And as you may recall, the setbacks apply based on the size of the home. So we took a typical 5,000 square foot lot, and in the upper diagrams, the yellow area is essentially the area that you could develop when applying the dynamic setbacks. And then down here, the gray and the white are 1- and 2-story kind of footprints. So you can see the dynamic setbacks effect on a smaller home. You know, you're not going to build out this whole yellow area. So it gives you a little bit more open space. It also gives you some design flexibility. You could set the home where it is shown here. You could move it over a little bit to the left. You could have some modulation in the facade, gives you a little bit more breathing room. When you get up to the 2,500 to 4,000 square foot home, you essentially have to build out that whole yellow area, but you could still get a 4,000 square foot home on a 5,000 square foot lot, even applying the dynamic setbacks. You would have to have a 2-story home. But it's not likely to result in someone increasing the lot size if they're looking to keep it under the 4,000 square feet. Above 4,000 square feet, your yellow gets much smaller. And I think at this point, it would likely trigger someone having to increase the lot size to accommodate a larger home. So in that sense, I think it's achieving its purpose. Based on this analysis, we're recommending the dynamic setbacks stay in place. We think they're compatible with the other standards that we're proposing and don't see any issue there. Another thing we looked at was some of the public works standards, and the city's got, I'd say, a good set of public works standards that were developed in 2016. And one of the interesting things is that the amount of on-street parking is applied based on the zone that the development occurs in. And one of the issues is that whether you're in the R4 and you would be applying this street section with just one row of on-street parking, or you're in the R6 and you get 2 lanes of on-street parking, is that the development pattern is very similar. The lot sizes and the home sizes are kind of condensed in one part of the development. And so the impact on the street in terms of the demand for street parking is actually quite similar, and yet we're using 2 different street typologies. So one of the things we're recommending is that there be some flexibility in how the standards are applied to projects so that you don't end up with this section here with 2 lanes of on-street parking in cases where there isn't a need for that much on-street parking. The result is you end up with an unnecessarily wide set of travel lanes and parking, and it can induce higher traffic speeds and potential safety issues. So one of the things we're trying to do is to right size that amount of parking. We certainly don't want to undershoot because we know there's been parking challenges in some neighborhoods, but we also don't want to see excessive asphalt and parking where it's not needed. Contributes to environmental issues with stormwater runoff. It's expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain. So we want to be just a little bit more targeted in how we apply these street sections. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to talk about the design principles, which are the first part of our neighborhood design standards section. So Leslie?
Great. Thanks, Jeff. The design principles are really to the question of what do we care about? What are we trying to accomplish with all these standards that we're writing? So these really are spring from the comprehensive plan, the vision statement, what people care about and want to see in their neighborhoods. And we found that the input that we've gotten over the course of the project has been very consistent with what you're spelling out in the comprehensive plan. So these are a basis for our decision making and really what we're trying to accomplish with the regulations. So one of the things that we've heard loud and clear is that Sammamish really values the ecological function of the land, their natural systems. And so what can we do with these regulations to make new development fit better into the ecological systems that are there? So the kinds of things that work for that are retaining the form of the land. So you can't really make the site transformed to meet the easiest footprints for your buildings. Really, your development has to fit onto the site itself. Retaining the trees is important, and retaining them in a way that they will stay healthy and stay there for the long term. Stormwater solutions that are not only beautiful, but really are assets to the neighborhood. And we're looking, we've talked a lot with the public works people about how we can do stormwater and how we can make the environmental features be a positive for the neighborhood. Okay. The green Northwest character goes along with that. And so that's talking about landscaping, buffers for sure, and the issues with topography. So that grade is handled in a sensitive way rather than just cuts and fences and retaining walls. And there's a lot of solutions for doing that in ways that are attractive. So the interface that's public along the street is something that we care about the most. And as you can see from the examples that Jeff showed, the garage entries really have an impact, whether they're the whole street ends up being frontage for the garage, or whether landscape can be incorporated in that important public face of homes along the street. The well-connected community is in a lot of ways about a walkable neighborhood. A lot of people are talking about 15-minute neighborhoods where you can walk easily to schools and small businesses. So the idea of having kids and bikes be able to move around neighborhoods is really important. And actually, there's some great examples of that out there with some shared streets. So in the neighborhood guideline thinking, we want to make places where people feel comfortable walking, where walking is an attractive option, especially where vehicle speeds can be lowered. We also want to make it family friendly. Sammamish is very much of a family friendly city, and the idea of people being able to walk and bike comfortably of all ages, 8 to 80. So that's something that when people especially are thinking about the subdivisions and the larger developments, planned unit developments, those are the kinds of things where some of these linkages, some of these gaps can be reconnected or connected.
Thank you, Leslie. So the design principles are intended to be more explanatory and to sort of orient the applicants around the goals of the comprehensive plan and what the community would like to see in terms of development outcomes. Oftentimes you'll hear developers or designers say, just tell us what you want. Sometimes it's hard to interpret from a series of just technical standards what exactly is the desired outcome. And so those design principles are intended to support that conversation. And applicants will be required to submit as part of their application statements on how they're furthering the design principles. But when it comes to approving or denying a project in terms of the review, the design standards will carry the day. And that's what these sections are. They are essentially the implementing piece for the design standards. So the topics include protection and incorporation of natural features, streets and connectivity, lots and sites, so how you're laying out your parcels and your developable area. Some new criteria for how we deal with the preservation of open space to address some of the issues that I described earlier, and sustainable site planning, which primarily deals with stormwater and other approaches to dealing with runoff in more environmentally sustainable ways. So I'll just highlight a couple of the standards. So one of the things that was in our scope early on is to develop arterial frontage standards. So this would be for new subdivisions in terms of how they relate to one of these arterials. And this map shows major arterials, minor arterials, and collectors. Those streets highlighted would all be subject to these new arterial frontage standards. And I'd also like to point out that because the city allows for the set aside of open space or buffers and that it be counted towards density, none of these standards should limit the number of units that can be developed. And overall, the design standards are exactly what they are intended to be, which is to influence the design of the project, but they're not necessarily meant to be limitations on the number of units or so that could be developed. It's more around how you organize the features in your development. So we've developed a number of arterial frontages that would be allowed on those streets. And I think the default one is the forest. So like the tree farm, if there is mature forest that contributes to that Northwest character, we'd like to see that preserved. We'd like to see it preserved for the first 100 or so feet, and there are some modifications that can happen as part of that. There's opportunities to, within that area, integrate trails or open space features. And again, this would not reduce the amount of units that could be developed. The next one is stormwater or green infrastructure. There's lots of examples along arterial frontages of stormwater ponds. Some are simply large vehicles for retaining water with chain link fences around them and really not much vegetation. Others, like this diagram here, which is a representation of a real example, I believe on 8th, is a more natural looking stormwater pond. It's got a nice split rail fence. It's got nice vegetation. It's a visual and physical amenity. And so the standards do address the design of stormwater facilities when they're placed along an arterial frontage. And again, this land that's set aside, as is currently in the code, can be applied to project density in other parts of the site, so it doesn't reduce the number of units that can be built. Landscape is another one. So in areas where there isn't mature forest that can be protected, you could have a landscaped area or buffer. There's some flexibility on this in terms of its width that we've incorporated into the code based on comments we've gotten from the public during the public hearing. This front-facing applies only to existing lots. So if there's an existing lot that's already been subdivided for single family, you have to orient your house towards the arterial with access from the side or rear. So we don't just have sort of rear decks or rear parts of the facade facing on directly onto the arterial. And there are some examples where developers have already done this in the community. Open space. So there is open space requirement, 390 square feet at least. And you could choose to locate that along the arterial frontage, use that density elsewhere in the site, but create a nice visual character along the arterial and provide amenities for people that live in the neighborhood. This is also for existing lots that predate the new standards, that you could have a retaining wall, but there's limits on how big that retaining wall could be. We know this has been an issue on some of the other projects, and you need to incorporate street trees and landscaping as well. So that's a highlight of the arterial frontage standards. Now moving into site design. These standards address primarily the relationship of the size of the home, what you see above ground. So this would include your garage and anything above ground. It would not include a basement or anything below ground. And what we're proposing is that there be a base limit floor to area ratio of 0.5. So the size of your home can be no larger than half the size of your lot. So if you have a 5,000 square foot lot, you can have a 2,500 square foot home. If you want a larger home, then you're going to need a larger lot. And as we just showed, there's flexibility to do that within the existing code. What this is going to do is it's going to create a little bit more breathing room on the individual lots themselves, and allow some flexibility for those that want to increase the lot size and increase the size of the home. One of the other things we're doing is we're going to exempt from the floor to area ratio under the proposal, detached accessory dwelling units. So because we're now going to have a little bit larger lots and a little bit smaller homes, we now have a little bit more open space on each individual lot that we could use for things like accessory dwelling units. So you might actually end up with 2 units on a lot as opposed to 1 large home. There's also a little bit of an FAR increase for a 2-family dwelling or multifamily dwelling. The other standard that we're proposing is a maximum width on the driveway. We would propose a maximum of 30% of the parcel width with a minimum of 12 feet to a maximum of 20 feet. This will do a couple things. It'll minimize the visual impact of parking along the street frontage. It will also create more opportunities for on-street parking because the wider driveways have been shown to sort of limit opportunities for on-street parking by kind of chopping up the curb space. We're also proposing a little bit of a new modification to building height calculations. And this diagram here shows the proposed new system, which is based on modules. Because one of the challenges with building on slope sites is you end up with a very tall lower wall, and then you have a shorter upper wall. By going into modules, you allow or require the designer to break up the different pieces of the development in a stair step, which minimizes the height of any individual wall and allows for the house to be designed to fit the site rather than manipulating the site to fit the house. We also have a parking setback. must be back. The required parking that you're providing on site must be set back at least 20 feet from the street. This could be in a driveway or in a garage. And here are just some more examples. There's lots of flexibility in how this would be could be designed. But for example, if you had a 10,000 square foot lot, you could have up to a 4,500 square foot main house, which is quite large. If you had a smaller home, you could reduce the lot size. Attached garage of 4,400 square feet and a detached ADU of 1,000 square feet. You end up with a lot coverage of 28%, which I believe is just the building coverage, and you end up with a yard area of 61%, which includes, which is the open space that's left over from the buildings and the driveway. Also, you'll see in this is that there's quite a bit more green space, which provides more opportunities for green stormwater approaches, and an emphasis on hopefully achieving more on-site retention and infiltration on each individual site. This is just another option. This option showed kind of a narrow lot along the street edge. This example shows more of a wider lot, and I think both can work. You can see the 20-foot driveway. The house is now oriented kind of the long way, but you still have opportunity for an ADU, on-street parking, and areas for stormwater treatment. Clearing and grading. We've made some fairly significant proposed changes to clearing and grading. So a couple of things. First, under the current code, there were quite a bit of exemptions for clearing and grading. So if you weren't dealing with significant trees, or you're only dealing with small, relatively small trees, I think it was less than 12 or 8 inches caliper based on the size of the tree or type of tree, which is still fairly large, you could go in and clear. And so what we're proposing is that in order to get a clearing and grading permit for an individual lot, you have to have an approved land use permit. And you get an approved land use permit by showing a site plan of what you're planning to develop. So where the house footprint will be, where the driveway is, all of those sorts of stuff, as opposed to allowing for mass grading and clearing at the subdivision level. So that's a big change. Essentially would eliminate preemptive clearing and grading of sites. Things like understory, which is very important for stormwater and the environment, would be preserved until it's developed, which I think is going to have a major impact. The other thing is you're now going to be required to design your home to your site. So if you're on a hilly site, you can't flatten your site and have essentially a flat home site design. These examples here are intentionally bold. We're not expecting that projects would necessarily be built like this, but for illustrative purposes, they show how buildings can be designed to fit their site and minimize the need for grading, the protection of trees. This example in the lower right, while a very different context, shows how you can kind of design it to be visually compatible and again, work well with a sloped site. Process improvements. There are a number of process improvements proposed. The first one deals with project guidance. So this is where applicants come in and are able to ask questions and have dialogue with staff, be able to share information and get everything they need to prepare for their more formal application. I think the staff has had good success with this process and sort of minimizing the need for future costly redesigns of projects. So there's additional projects that will be required to go through project guidance. There's now going to be a requirement for a pre-construction meeting. And part of the purpose is to have a handoff from the planning staff to the building staff and those that are going to be responsible for monitoring construction, as well as go over all of the various requirements with the applicant prior to starting construction. The UZDP process in the town center, currently a review and decision by the director and appeal to the hearing examiner, is proposed to become a type 3 process with a recommendation from the director and a decision by the hearing examiner. For school developments, right now, a new school is a type 1 process, which is essentially a building permit. There's very little sort of public opportunity for public review and input, and there's no appeal. We're proposing that that go to a type 2 process, which would be a director's decision and allow for more opportunity for public input. And then we've modernized some of the notice requirements. So for example, instead of posting in a newspaper, notices will be posted online on the city's website. We're also working on some other requirements and signage for noticing of application in residential areas that are subject to this effort. Okay, now we're going to go into the Unified Development Code. I'm just checking to see if my colleague Lee is here. He is not here. Okay. So the Unified Development Code, as I said earlier, is an opportunity to combine several of the titles in the municipal code that deal with development and put them into a new consistent format that's easy to understand, easy to navigate, consistent style and formatting, easy to understand graphics, those sorts of things. And so this is the outline for the Unified Development Code. The first section would be a new section. This would be a preface or a user guide. This would orient the applicant to how to use the Unified Development Code, what the expectations are, and those sorts of things. The second section would be the new neighborhood design piece that we just went over. The next would be environment and sustainability. This would combine things like the stormwater code, the critical areas code, the SEPA ordinance, and anything else related to environment and sustainability. We felt it was important to put that kind of upfront because we know it's a foundational value for the community as expressed in the comprehensive plan. Then we go into the zoning districts, and we're going to have some new zoning district profiles and some graphics to highlight or show some of the existing standards in the code. The next would go into the land uses, then development standards, which are currently in 21A. And then the town center and the public works and building sections are simply being imported and renumbered, but they're not being changed. We know there could be some changes to these in the future. It sounds like Public Works is planning to take a look at their standards next year, so they would be set up to do that. But we're not currently proposing to make any changes to those parts right now. 2180 would be all of the administrative provisions, which are in some different parts of the codes. And then finally, definitions, which would be definitions that apply to all of the code. There will be some definitions in the various sections up above that are specific to that chapter. So we've developed some fonts and colors and logos that can be used in the code document and on the cover. So these are examples of that. We have black and white versions, pretty simple, but I think will help build some identity around the code and familiarity. And then these are some of the different colors that are being used, accent colors, fonts, and styles. And then here are a few sample pages that we put together so you can get a sense of the look and feel. This was designed in InDesign. And we've been looking at some tools that the city could use to host this online and having discussions with legal and other city staff about that. But this just gives you the look and feel of one of the sections and the table of contents for that. Each of the top will have sort of a header that will orient you to which chapter you're in, and then which section within that. This one's on land division. We're going with a 2-column landscape format, which works well with maps and graphics as well. We'll show you an example of that in a moment. This is just a table example, an existing table from your critical areas section. With kind of a nice consistent look and feel, and you can see the header has changed to highlight the chapter. And again, another part of that section just showing a smaller table and how it kind of nests into the column. And then finally, we just chose one page that had an existing graphic. Many of the existing graphics had poor resolution, so we didn't choose them. But this is from the Town Center Code, and you can see the existing graphic works well in the new format. And that's the conclusion of our presentation. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everyone that's participated in the process to date. The members of the community advisory group, those that took the survey, the many members of the public that have attended the planning commission meetings and provided really valuable comments that we've incorporated into changes. The success of a project like this really depends on public input and participation. So I just wanted to thank everyone that's participated. And with that, I'll turn it back over for any questions or discussion.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions that from people in the chat box. So first one up is Councilmember Odell.
Let me go to my questions. On the Highcroft example,
yeah,
you showed a bunch of open space that was set aside. I was wondering, was that originally buildable land or wetland that was not buildable?
David can correct me if I'm wrong. We didn't look into that in great detail, but I believe it is counted towards the density. Therefore, it was at least theoretically buildable land.
Okay. And then
there's some pretty steep topography on some of it.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering.
I can jump in and clarify. I actually just looked it up. And there are several tracks on that project. There is one tract that is to the north in the center of the project that is a native growth protection area tract. There's a wetland there. There is a large tract that is to the southeast portion of the property, and that is an open space tract, tree retention and open space tract. It's not critical areas.
Okay.
So I just wanted to clarify that. It's a mixture on that project.
Okay. And then on the second question for me on the ADU issue on R4 lots, what do we do about parking for the additional people in the ADU? Are they just on the street? Or is that going to be taken into account in some formula somehow?
Yeah, I believe, and David can again correct me, but I believe the city would require at least an additional parking stall for the ADU. Some cities do, some cities don't, but that's typically what we see, and we're not proposing a change to that. So whatever the existing ADU parking requirement is, it would apply. David, do you know if it's...
Yeah. So the way the code works currently is that for any new single-family residence, you need to provide 2 off-street parking spaces. And if you add an ADU, it requires an additional parking space. However, if the site already has 4 parking spaces, then you're not required to add additional parking. That's what the code says today.
David, what about places that exist as a single-family house that only have 2, and then they add an ADU?
They would have to provide a 3rd parking space.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, then I see Ken Gamblin has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, 2 quick questions. Number one, right at the beginning, there was a public survey. And I'm wondering if we have any more granular results on that. I don't need to see them right now, but I'd love to have them sent out if you do have it a little more granular than we're seeing it here. These seems like gross results. So if you have that, I'd really like to see it.
Yes, I believe we do. Well, we certainly have more questions, and we might be able to parse out these responses by, how they answered an earlier question. So we'll make sure we send that out.
Yeah, that'd be great, Jeff. Thank you. Second question I have is on the floor area ratio. You used a different word for it, but it doesn't seem that it really is a one size fits all, in that you're looking at the number of stories in the house. And I think Councilmember Odell alluded to this in a question of his. Do you guys adjust at all? Because it seems one of the things we're trying to accomplish is not to have a big, huge footprint in a little tiny lot. But obviously, if you take that huge footprint and turn it into 2 stories, it's now half the size that it was before. So how do you guys adjust understanding that the overall square footage of the house, lot coverage-wise, footprint-wise, is going to be half or a third, depending on this 2 or 3 story house?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So right now, my understanding is the city has it varies a little bit by zone, but the city has a building coverage requirement, but it doesn't have a lot coverage limit. So I think that's part of the reason why developers are currently able to have such large homes on small lots. So in the case of, would someone build a much larger footprint 1-story building versus a smaller footprint but same size 2-story house? I think the incentive is already baked in to do the 2-story because they will have trouble fitting the 1-story footprint on the smaller lot. And so I think to some degree, there will be an incentive for the smaller footprint. With that being said, certainly it is within the city's purview to regulate building footprint or building coverage. And that's, I guess, a lever or a dial that we could change if that was something you'd like us to look into. But right now, we haven't made any changes to the footprint standards.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's just a question of what's trying to be accomplished. If we're trying to accomplish having a smaller or a larger looking lot, or are we trying to accomplish having a reasonable size square footage of a house? And I'm not indicating which way that I'm looking at it, but it's a question that I have, and possibly we can I can chat offline with you folks on it.
Right, yes, thanks.
If I could jump in here for a second. So we do regulate the inverse. We have a yard area requirement. We have a minimum yard area requirement for new residences being built. And what that does is it restricts the amount of building footprint that you can have on a property. So it does achieve something similar, although there is opportunity for that to be fine-tuned and clarified, because the definition of yard area allows for things like uncovered decks. It allows for the placement of things like astroturf or other hardened features. So it's really about the definition of that, and you know, we're not opposed to making the jump to adding a direct restriction on the amount of lot coverage that you can have on a lot by lot basis.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Jeff.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I have a couple of questions, like kind of on a lot of different topics, so I'll try to run through them really quickly. I love that we do have these flexible regulations for ADUs, but you know, in terms of lots that are still available, how many would really be large enough to put ADUs on? I guess I just want to make sure that we all have reasonable expectations about just how much ADUs will reasonably be built, and that will reasonably solve or address any affordable housing issues. Because I think, David, you alluded to it, we don't have very many of them built, and I think part of it is like, I know, you know, it's going to be tough to squeeze that into a lot of lots. Even with these new regulations, it's going to make it pretty challenging to put an ADU on a lot of lots. So do we have a sense of how many lots we would even have that would even reasonably support an ADU?
Yeah, I certainly don't have a sense of the number of lots, but I could say that for most of the existing lots, you're correct. And I think the issue is that the principal dwelling fills out so much of the lot that the only place that you could do an ADU would be to sort of develop it inside the footprint of the existing home.
Right.
And that's, I think, less likely to happen. So I think what would have to happen now is that because of the FAR standards and the neighborhood design standards, you would be creating lots and sites that would be more forward compatible with doing a detached ADU. So I agree with you. It may not have as much impact on existing lots and particularly those with larger homes, but certainly for newer subdivisions, this would, I think, give us more certainty that it would at least be forward compatible, if not developed at the initial time that the principal dwelling was.
Yeah, and I just, again, just to set the expectations
Yeah.
for, council and for the public, we don't have a lot of places where we're going to have new subdivisions. So, I think it's just, I love ADUs. I love the idea of it. I think it's great to be able to create, these units that could be more affordable, that could address, family issues, that kind of stuff. But I just don't think we're going to see a lot of that in Sammamish. We're just not really set up for that. So I just wanted to kind of double check my thought on that. David, you brought up way back on slide 9 when you were starting that not many homes have been built with the new regulations. And I was just curious. I know through the work we've done with the GMPC and stuff, we have submitted that we had about 660 units, I think, in the pipeline, including, kind of short plats and all, and subdivisions and all that kind of stuff. About 440 of those, if I recall correctly, and this is me trying to go off the top of my head, were part of the town center UZDP. So that would leave, roughly 220 units. Is my math roughly accurate there, David? If I recall?
I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. Unfortunately, in life, numbers are not one of the things that I can recall offhand, so I apologize.
No worries. I have a pretty good
birthdays and numbers.
All right. Well, let's assume it's around that, and we can double check that. But I was just curious if we could get some information on, of those roughly between 200 and 250, somewhere in there, how many of those were applications that came in before the moratorium in the fall of 2017, and how many have come in since then? Because it would be interesting to kind of get a sense of that. Is that something we could possibly get? I know you can't probably produce that off the top of your head.
We can easily tell you and produce a number for you at the next meeting that tells you how many units have come in and are in process following the adoption of the updated development regulations in May of 2019.
Okay.
That's real easy for us. I do know that it is not a high number, that a majority of the units that remain in our pipeline are units that were in process in some stage prior to development regs update phase 2, which was passed in May of 2019.
Okay, cool.
So the difficult thing for us is, even if we try and make changes to our development regulations to affect outcomes, there are projects that remain vested under state law. And that's really important, like I said before, for everyone to remember, is that it's not the city's choice to allow these projects to remain vested, that subdivisions are really, and I don't know another way to say this, are really the holy grail of land use law. They are, given the highest level of protection by the legislature and by the courts. So we can't do anything about that.
Yeah, totally. And again, I think it's just good to remind the public of that so that we set appropriate expectations. One of the big things that jumped out at me in reading through this is, how do these standards address a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, right? We saw from the community, and again, it'd be great to get some more granularity, but we saw from the community that the environment and sustainability are really important. And when I think about, the impacts to the environment and to ecology, tree retention, super important, stormwater management, and, how much impervious surface we have, super important. But there's also that greenhouse gas reduction element as well. And has that been taken into consideration as we've been developing some of these standards?
Yeah, I can start on that one. I would say that it wasn't a focus of the core scope, but the planned unit development code that we had essentially produced a draft of, I think probably took the biggest step towards creating regulations that could have an impact on that. A couple of things that we were looking at, and hopefully we'll get to revisit. was sort of making the economics work better for developing smaller units, which would have less greenhouse gas use, provide for more compact development patterns and potentially more walkability. And the way that we were doing that was essentially taking the floor to area ratio, or what that square footage allocation would be. And instead of capping it at the number of units in the zone, allowing that same square footage to be divided up into smaller units. So again, making the economics work for smaller units, whereas now I think the incentive is to build the largest home possible on the smallest lot. So that's probably as far as we got in terms of that piece. The other thing in the Planned Unit Development Code, which we had looked at, was some small allocation or allowance for commercial use. Something like a daycare or maybe a coffee shop, not necessarily like a neighborhood district or anything super urban, but something small scale that could provide more proximity between residential neighborhoods and neighborhood services. So those I think were the highlights of where we may have addressed that issue to some degree.
Awesome. And that leads perfectly into what my next question was, which was, you guys talked about walkability and a desire for amenities. And you mentioned on the slide, you mentioned like parks and play areas, but were there other amenities that people called out? Because when I think of walkability, like, yeah, I want to be able to walk to the park, but I also want to be able to walk to the coffee shop or the drugstore or the grocery store, or maybe even a restaurant, because if I can walk to all of those things and I either can leave my car in the garage, or maybe I don't need as many cars for my family, which I think is really the goal here, right? Fewer cars means fewer greenhouse gas emissions, means less impervious surface because I don't need as many parking spaces, all of that kind of stuff. And, again, car ownership is like the third highest household expense now. So it would be a real boon to our families as well if we could design things so that so every person didn't need a car to do every little thing they need.
Yeah. Good question. So I think there's kind of two facets of walkability. The first facet is, being able to walk to a coffee shop or to a store, sort of meet your daily needs. And in some locations in Sammamish, that's honestly challenging, given topography, proximity of residential neighborhoods to sort of commercial or service areas. But the other facet of walkability is sort of, could be more recreational or social. And I think that's something that Sammamish does particularly well. You have a great trail system, you're in a fantastic natural environment, there's always people out walking with their friends and neighbors or with their family. And I think that's important as well. But I think, in order to provide those sort of access to services, there'd have to be, in some cases, some land use changes that would have to be made. One of the things we explored a little bit, but didn't get too far on, is even absent the PUD code, could there be small scale commercial uses that could be allowed in a residential neighborhood? I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I think the pandemic has brought about some creative thinking. And there are some examples of cities kind of taking that opportunity and making structural changes to their zoning to allow for small scale commercial uses and amenities within residential homes.
Great. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
If I could add to that, we already have seen a significant uptick in the number of in-home businesses that are operating, and we see an increased need in possibly neighborhood level, small scale commercial space, and we think there is a demand for that in the city currently. It's just a question of how do we manage that? How do we make sure that it doesn't turn into something that changes the character of neighborhoods? So that is on our radar, and that is something we would like to take on in the long term. I don't know if that's going to happen with this project here, but it is something that we have been tracking. Just one more response to the greenhouse gas emissions question. And one of the problems that we see in the community currently with the way homes are being built is with the small setbacks and with the type of clearing that's occurring, the grading that's occurring, and the way homes are being built. is it really precludes regeneration of meaningful forest canopy. So one of the things we're looking at with this project is if we provide some additional separation between buildings, or if we look at limiting the amount of grading that's occurring wherein the topsoil isn't being stripped off to the level that it's being stripped off today, wherein, you know, meaningful patches of vegetation could be retained, that I think that it might ultimately result in a reduction in the amount of cooling that's needed in the city. And that's a big trend we're seeing is the highest number of electrical permits that we get and mechanical permits that we get are for people adding AC units to their homes. And that's indicative of a changing climate where people are needing to cool their homes. But if you're able to build a smaller home with better insulation and better canopy around it, then you might find that that's not actually needed, and that need for that additional electrical draw in the summer during peak heat waves would be reduced. So that's one thing we're also considering here.
And David, I love that. This is where I would love to see us kind of do some of the math on this, because I think all of this is important. And I think what's really, at least from my perspective, what's really important is we pencil out the math on what of these things will actually have the biggest impact. Because I know that, you know, you already touched on smaller homes. I think that's important, right? Larger homes, you know, we already know that wealthier neighborhoods that have larger homes, that have less, you know, public transit, that, you know, don't focus on those things, they have 25% higher per capita greenhouse gas emissions than those of the lower income areas. And I think that we need to understand which of those factors is the biggest contributor. Is it the size of the house? Is it the lack of, you know, obviously wealthier neighborhoods already have more trees than poorer neighborhoods. So while again, I think it's a part of it, how do we make sure that the things we focus on are actually addressing the problem in a meaningful way? And so I would love to see us do some of that math to make sure that we are addressing that, because it is a cycle, right? And they all have an impact. But to just say, well, we're going to have more trees and that's going to solve the problem, I'm not sure that it does. I think it's part of it and it has to be part of a bigger plan. But I think there are a lot of other things that are contributing a lot more greenhouse gases and contributing to the larger problem that we need to understand and make sure we're addressing. So I'm loving that you guys are looking at that. And I'd love to see a little bit more math on that. I think I just have two more questions, actually three. One, going back to the floor to area ratio, I thought when Councilmember Odell asked about that, you said that the floor to area ratio took into consideration all of the floors above ground. So when we say we have a 0.5 limit on floor to area ratio, I can make it a two-story house, but it's going to include the area of both the first and second story, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we're not gonna see people saying, well, I'm gonna have a smaller footprint on the ground, so I have the right setbacks, and I'll just build it taller. We're limiting that as well with that floor to area ratio.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead.
It's a volume limit.
Yeah. It's essentially a control on bulk and scale, and so that's why everything above ground is included. If you're below ground, you know, that's not counted towards it.
Fair enough. And just wondering, is the 0.5 limit only apply to like the R1 through R8 zoning? Because you did mention that it's a little bit different for multifamily, which I think is important, right? Because you have different goals and different purposes for the multifamily and the higher zone, the more compact areas. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Okay, great. And are there other differences, you know, in those zoning areas? Because again, I do think it's important to have these standards in our sort of R1 through R8. But when you get up into higher than R8, we really do have different goals and different purposes. So I would think that a lot of these standards are going to be different for those. Is that also accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. Some of these standards don't apply in those zones. Some things like the arterial frontages are applied differently in those areas because, well, for starters, there's a lot less land that is in those zones. So we also factored that in, and the developments are typically smaller in scale. So yes, we have sort of parsed out standards for the R8 and lower and the R12 to R16.
That's great. And
Sorry.
again, going back to, kind of a greenhouse gas and a sustainability perspective, I think it makes sense because if you have multifamily, apartment buildings, condos, those types of things, the per capita greenhouse gas emissions in those units is going to be way smaller than in a single family home, right? You're going to take out less trees per unit. You're going to just do everything less per unit. You have fewer external walls, which has a huge impact on energy consumption. So I'm glad that we're taking that into consideration. What did the school districts have to say about any of this? Do we get feedback from them both on just sort of the
Yes.
general regulations as well as moving to a type 2 process? Are there any concerns there from them?
Yes, we got a letter from them, and I think my recollection is we accommodated all of their requested changes. One of the changes was around the siting and buffering of parking lots, and they recommended a 30-foot buffer, I believe, and so we accommodated that. They did not. We did not change the process. I'm not sure that they necessarily opposed the process, but they did have some comments on it. So
Great.
I don't know if David has anything to add, but I feel like we listened to what they had to say and made some pretty significant modifications based on their comments.
Agreed. Yeah, in many cases, a school project is subject to SEPA anyway, and that is a type 2 process. Yeah. So making a school permit a type 2 process is not out of line with what they're already having to go through. The council could look at accepting smaller additions or things of that nature from the type 2 process and really make it only applicable to larger projects like a complete tear down rebuild or a significant expansion, which would require SEPA anyway. So if the council chose to align it that way, that's something we could definitely do.
Great, thanks. I just know we want to really partner with our school districts because we know they've got challenges, and we want to make sure we can accommodate that. And again, especially when you think about the pandemic, we might even need a little bit more space. So can we help them with that? And then last but not least, and this is kind of separate, but I love that you created standards for like the fonts and the colors. I think that's really important to give us consistency. The one question I have is that did we put these through an accessibility review? To me, just looking at this, some of the contrast seems a little bit low on some of these. And if you have any vision challenges, that can make it really difficult to read.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We will go back and make sure that it meets the current standards. And if we have to make changes, we will. We did an accessible document recently for culture, so we have gained some experience in that, and we'll make sure that we hit the target on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to see if who my other hands may be here.
I've got my hand up. I'm just not sure you can see it in the...
No, it's difficult. Oh, yeah, because you kind of got yellow everywhere. So I'm going to go Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. So a couple of thoughts as other folks were talking. David, when Councilmember Stewart asked about the bulk of the projects that are still vested to older code, you mentioned the 2019 regulations, but there was another set of regulations prior to those, is my recollection. And the reason that it is in my mind is, I believe it was last week, we approved Stone Creek, which is the carrier plat. And I had to ask some questions because when I drove by, I was like, I know that backyard is not 15 feet. And we used to have 5, 7, 15 for our setbacks. And the response back from staff was that it predated that. So we clearly have some very old vested properties in there too. So it might be easier, I think, for council and subsequently for the public to understand how many are vested into what set of code as far as those setbacks go, because it does make a big difference. Those are 4,000 square foot lots and they're putting in 4,000 square foot homes. So they're tiny lots and giant houses. And I appreciate what you said, David, earlier about, you know, trying to create some additional space here between homes, because when you have homes that are, and essentially many of those are essentially 3 stories on the front side, they're 2 stories on the back. And I remember that we used to average for the height limitation. I think we've changed that subsequently as well, but there's no way you can grow a tree between those homes. And frankly, based on that old code, you can't even plant a tree in the backyard. There's no room. So I think what we're trying to do here, and I know I was, you know, one of the council members of a previous council that was pushing to do this development code, is that so that we do have the opportunity to preserve and you know, hopefully someday expand our urban tree canopy. You know, kudos to both staff and the Planning Commission for digging into this. It's a big topic to tackle. But I did want to ask one question, because I know in my first term on council, and I think Councilmember Odell's second term on council, maybe his third, I'm not sure. We had looked at trying to do some transitions between residential zones, like from the R1 to the R4 and R4 to R6, because sometimes you can have, you know, the R1 abutting R6, and it is such a stark contrast between those 2 zones coming together. And we were trying to create something for a buffer between those, just so that it didn't look so stark of a contrast between R1, and I can use Lancaster as an example of homes that are on very large lots, and then they are abutting up to, I think it's Big Rock Vista, and those are going to be big homes on tiny lots, and there's just no transition there. Is that anything that might be accomplished through the development code that we're tackling here?
Yeah, I'll start on that. Good question. The proposed neighborhood design standards do not require a buffer, but it could be pretty easily incorporated based on the structure that we developed. But one of the things that we did include is criteria for the preservation of open space. And so currently a developer can come in and basically propose kind of any configuration of open space, set aside, and again, apply that density to other parts of the site. What the new code does is it establishes some criteria that would need to be approved by the city for the design and function of that open space. And so there's a number of types that are listed there, and they're sort of correlated with potential public benefits. And one of the open space types is a forested buffer. And the example that we showed in the Laurels, I think, is a great example of a planned unit development with a very kind of compact home sites, but then this really nice forested buffer along the edges, which provides that transition. So the short answer is we don't have a requirement for it. It is something that developers could choose to incorporate, and is something that I think is encouraged. And if the city wanted to go and take the next step and incorporate that as a requirement, I think we could certainly do that using some of the code that we've already developed.
So it'd be interesting to understand from a development standpoint, and I understand that we're probably not going to see another Laurels be constructed, nor a Highcroft, because the amount of land just doesn't exist anymore. But the difference between a Laurels neighborhood where we have, you know, small home sites, smaller homes, but not a lot of space, so they're not putting a lot of trees on their property, but they were able to maintain kind of the forest around it and that buffer that I think Councilmember Odell and I had kind of, you know, hoped for moving forward. How many trees in that, you know, ideal setting are preserved through the buffer versus putting, you know, having the floor to air, the floor area ratio where you have, 0.5 and you have a smaller footprint of a home on a lot, and the ability to preserve trees. I suspect we're able to preserve more trees, frankly, in the Laurels scenario than we would be, because they might be able to plant new trees if
Yes.
they have like the 0.5, but we're not preserving the older trees.
Yeah.
Which frankly, in the wintertime, do a better job than, a small tree that doesn't have a DBH of 20 inches or something like that. But I would be interested, I guess, to know where the benefit is.
Yeah, I think there is a better chance of preserving mature trees in the Laurels model, in buffers and in open space. And I think primarily that one of the reasons is that, preserving trees on individual lots, particularly if they're significant trees, can make construction more challenging, and they would also have to provide financial guarantees for those. So I think there may be some aversion from developers to preserve trees on individual lots. I would also say that even though the lots are fairly small in the Laurels, there's actually quite a bit of landscaping. And if you look here, again, these aren't mature trees that were preserved, but they're fairly mature now. And you can see that there's quite a bit of street trees and other vegetation that really, I think, adds to the aesthetic quality of the development. So I think both from a landscape standpoint and from a sort of tree preservation standpoint, this works pretty well. And most of these lots, I think, are about an FAR of 0.5 or pretty close. Yeah.
And really, the Laurels is probably a pretty good example of, I think, what Councilmember Odell and I were trying to work toward, because really what we wanted was, if you were bordering a certain classification of roadway, like principal, arterial, collector, that we were trying to have like a type 1 landscape. So basically, so you couldn't see the neighborhood, frankly, and it felt more like, I think, what Sammamish kind of identifies itself as. And the Laurels, I've been in there several times. I know exactly what it looks like in there, but it does have a very nice buffer out there along 24th. Is that what it is?
Yeah. Yep.
So I mean, I think there are trade-offs, and it frankly, it kind of depends on the location as to what works in that scenario. But I wouldn't want to completely disregard a Laurels if there were, mature forests around it, and it could, serve the function of preserving mature trees while providing kind of that buffer. Because, I mean, to use another example, Highcroft, right, just smacks you in the face right there on 228th, because all the homes on their 3 stories are all facing 228th, and there is no buffer. And that, I think, that was the precipice, frankly, in Sammamish in, I think, 2014, when it started going in, that kind of, broke the camel's back as far as our community and what they wanted to see change. So I think we want to avoid that. And if we're going to have, these compact sites have a more Laurels type look, so that our general public doesn't drive by and feel like the homes are like over the street at them.
Yeah, we've found this in outreach on other projects too, that visual component has a really big impact on people's perception of a development. We did the comprehensive plan for the city. I worked on the comprehensive plan for the city of Chelan several years ago, and wrote some hillside development standards for them, because they were having a lot of these same issues, but in a different type of environment. And through that process, there's one example, which is actually a fairly well-designed neighborhood, but it's on top of a hill, and everyone in the community hated it because it has sort of changed the natural landscape. But that there was another development that was sort of like the Laurels that you couldn't see, that clearly wasn't quite as well designed, but people had no issue with it. And thought it was fine. So I think that kind of speaks to the point that you were making. And, everything's about trade-offs, right? So you're not going to love everything. And we had actually done a diagram that sort of took the Laurels and added some elements that we felt were missing. Like there could be some better connections here to the east and west. I don't particularly like that it's completely insular to itself. Maybe it could have a trail connection going through it. So I think there are other qualities that the community might not to like, but certainly how they've provided the open space and stormwater and recreation and the buffer and the landscaping is, I think, all quite nice.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, thanks to staff for working really hard on this and to the Planning Commission for their time and energy on it as well.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we only have a couple more, and then we can move on. And so, Councilmember Odell.
Thanks, and guys, great job on this report overall. I really do like what I'm seeing in it. I do have a couple of comments, though. First of all, if there was one development that created a lot of hate mail the last time I was on council, it was Highcroft. I've never seen such a negative reaction from the residents of Sammamish to a development as that one generated. So please don't let that happen again. A couple of things. David, I think you mentioned side setbacks. We're now at 5-foot side setbacks, I believe, as a minimum for like R4 and or anything, I think. We used to have our 7-foot setbacks, and the fire chief only reluctantly agreed to go down. He had his arm twisted. But we've had a couple of structure fires in recent years where the setback has been, shall we say, a little tight, and the adjoining structure got involved very easily. So that's one thing. Second thing is going back to your comment about the effect on tree planting capability. You may not be able to plant a sequoia there, but you might be able to get a smaller smaller evergreen or deciduous tree in, if it was bigger, where you can't get to grow in a 5-foot setback area or not grow well, put it that way. Dual use of certain things. I want to mention this. My neighborhood, Heritage Hills, which is on the north part of Saholly Way, is now 30-some years old, but it has a lot of very mature trees in it now, a lot of which have been growing up along the trails that exist between the houses in the right-of-way there, plus the stormwater facility. The whole thing drains, or most of it drains, into one big storm drainage facility that's in the park. To drive by, you wouldn't realize what it was. It's flat. There are goalposts at both ends. And during the dry season, it's a playfield. During the wet season, it's usually not covered with water, but I've seen as much as 1.5 feet of water in what I call Lake Heritage. It trickles out gradually, meter down to the creek. So this is a concept I think I would encourage us to look at doing everywhere we can. Not just putting holes in the ground and calling it good, or big retention cisterns down there, but let's do something with the ground that makes it usable. The second thing is the turnarounds at the end of cul-de-sacs often are concrete expanses or asphalt expanses. Cut a hole in the middle of it and plant trees there. You have many requirements to be able to have UPS trucks and fire engines be able to get through there, or moving vans. You can still do that and still have room to plant a small cluster of trees. And I got to tell you, the kids in my neighborhood make full use of them. So that's another good community advantage. We go from R1 to R4. Should we be thinking about R2 and R3? And I say that because we have a lot of R1s that are being chased by developers to do an assembly. I know I've got several friends, my wife has several friends who are neighbors, and they've had developers knocking on their doors wanting to do an assembly and a short plat. But maybe somewhere in between could be something besides going from R1 to R4, particularly in a neighborhood that's largely R1 to begin with. That could be something that might be worth thinking about. And I appreciate your comments on that, David. On the FAR question, the one way around it might be to take the average of the square footage of the house, or the square footage of the house, as a ratio of the square footage of the lot. And that would determine how big it gets and how high it gets. And maybe this is effectively what the floor area ratio device does, but I have this uncomfortable feeling that maybe it doesn't. Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm thinking that this would be another way of approaching the issue and getting this game maybe a better result. And then 5, the fifth thing is, yes, Christy was right. She and I did a lot of work on the buffers issues, and I think we should go back and look at that again. I know it wasn't accepted before, but I think time is right to do it again. My comments, thank you. And if you guys have any come back to me, I'd love to hear it.
Councilmember Treen.
Yeah, so the third project stage will begin September 14th. With this meeting, this stage will include the City Council's review of the draft code amendments, additions, Unified Development Code outline. You're going to incorporate, so what I'm understanding is what you've done is you've incorporated the development regulations, including draft language being developed as part of this phase for the into the Unified Development Code, which obviously is a draft, which is going to go, if I understand this correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong here, then it will go actually back to the Planning Commission.
Yeah, so this is something that we want to clarify for you. I really appreciate this question because we have internally talked about how this all works. So basically there's 2 tracks that we're currently on. We are amending the existing development regulations in their current layout and configuration, Title 21A, other sections that might go along with that, Title 16. And at the same time, we're working on another track to reassemble the code into a unified development code. Once the council settles on which code changes it wants to make to the current code, those changes will be rolled into the unified development code, and the council will then be presented with a final package for adoption that will be those changes made to the current code in the new format of the Unified Development Code, and the adoption will ultimately repeal a number of chapters of our municipal code in favor of replacing them with a Unified Development Code. So there are many sections of code that are being ported over into the new Unified Development Code that are not being touched. They are being renumbered. The language is not being changed at all. Examples of that are Title 14A and Title 13, Public Works Code sections. But what we wanted to do was after a long conversation about how our code works and where we see common points of confusion on the part of the community, builders, applicants, residents, whomever it might be, our code is sometimes characterized as highly unorganized and difficult to read and difficult to follow. So we're really trying to make it accessible to everybody by putting it in a different format and bundling it together into a new restructured code that is more user-friendly and easier to find things in. Now, understand that this is the first step in really ultimately what will be our unified development code for the long term. So we completely envision a phase 3 to updating our development regs, where the council will have another opportunity to get in and fine tune things once we have a little bit of working experience with the new unified development code. And the council has the ability to set that work plan at the retreat coming up next year. And we'll definitely be looking forward to that fine-tuning stage, if you will. These three phases, the first phase was what I call the course adjustment, and that was in response to community outcry over really bad outcomes, Highcroft, for example. And we made some real big changes to the code there as part of Development Code Regulations Phase 1, began in September of 2018, it ended in May of 2019. Following that, the council budgeted and made a priority on the department's work plan of Phase 2 development regs. And what we were supposed to do with that is create a unified development code and continue to make meaningful adjustments to the existing code that would ultimately result in better outcomes in development in certain areas. And we listed off those areas here in tonight's presentation. So we completely anticipate and envision a Phase 3, which will be an even, I guess, more granular fine-tuning of the code, where we'll be able to go through the entire new unified development code, which in most cases is existing language, it's just repackaged. And we'll be able to look at things like word choice, should versus shall. We'll be able to look at things like, is that dimension right? Where are what I call the dials and levers in that new code that we can adjust in order to get the best outcome possible for the community?
Thank you, David. And then after, I got it. Planning Commission, then it's going to come back to us. There's 2 tracks we're on. I got it. Excellent.
So to clarify, it doesn't go back to Planning Commission, not Phase 2. Phase 2 has made it through Planning Commission. The Planning Commission has looked at the Unified Development Code outline. Planning Commission has looked at the proposed changes to the existing code, and they've made a recommendation to you on both.
Okay.
Now we are planning to give the Planning Commission an update on what the council is doing, just to keep communication going. We've learned that it's best if we are constantly exchanging communications between the council and the Planning Commission, with staff as the conduit to exchange those communications, because it keeps both bodies informed as to what the other is up to, and it helps reduce the amount of error on what the Planning Commission might be working on, et cetera.
So then the second question that I have is, in this unified code, or the code that you're bringing, regulations, Phase 2 regulations, is moving stormwater to the beginning of the application process a part of what will come forward?
So from our perspective, yes, because 21, I can believe there's a typo there. I think it should be 21.10, so I apologize for that. 21.10 on the slide in front of you here should be is neighborhood design, and then 21.20 is environment and sustainability. Both of those sections include language around sustainability, language around site design, language around trying to change the culture of design and development to really fit the project into the existing landscape, as opposed to the opposite, manipulating the landscape to fit the project. We've talked about this in the past with the council, and while the public works and buildings under 2170 and development standards under 2150 are further down, that's okay, because the neighborhood design and the environment and sustainability sections, which really set the expectation for development, are up front and center. So the first things we're going to be talking about with developers when they come in the door is neighborhood design and environment and sustainability. And to us, really, we have to disclose to applicants up front what we expect of them early on in more of a qualitative sense, before we start layering on the quantitative standards regarding setbacks and stormwater and street designs, because we have to get their mindset in the right place before they even begin laying out a project.
Yeah, and I noticed you guys started the whole thing with the vision from the comprehensive plan. So I do appreciate that as your starting point from our comp plan then we're moving from our comp plan to our regulations, and then you're bringing forward in those design standards that are necessary so that the outcomes that are on the ground are somewhat predictable or closer to what we think we should be seeing.
Yes, that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate that. The only thing I heard tonight that I have two concerns. So my questions are done. So I just have two concerns. So the first one was on setbacks. 30 feet for any large scale operation like a school or a library or whatever, large building, large construction thing. 30 feet is nothing. That's over 20 years, that would be one tree. That's the space of the canopy of one tree. Okay, so if it's anything less than 50, it's really why I get why we're doing 30 feet, but that's nothing. If I were looking at code and I'm looking at my streams to protect the fish in the lakes and the streams and in a sense kind of creating wildlife corridors, sorry everybody, but by creating wildlife corridors along our streams, I need 150 feet to 200 feet of setback to really make that something that is an amenity to the city, to everyone. So that's my biggest concern is setbacks for different land use things that are going on. So I would definitely, if your frameworks guy has a better pencil and he could make those numbers larger, I would be more inclined to be a vote for what would be brought forward. The second concern that I have is, well, how do I well, actually, I'm going to hold my second concern because I think that it has ramifications on other things. I guess the thing, if the UDZP, I have to be very careful here, if it's going to have a lot of variances, modifications, deviations, that kind of language in the code, that concerns me as not only a council member, but then also as a resident. So I will just throw it out in that way, David. Does that make sense?
So just a clarification, the only thing that we are proposing to change regarding a UZDP, which is a town center type permit type, is to make it, change it from a type 2 director's decision to a type 3 hearing examiner's decision. Because we found that the scope and scale of those projects is such that it's similar to a subdivision, maybe even more intense of an application, and really warrants going to a hearing examiner. Typically with a type 3 application, the staff and the director make a recommendation to the hearing examiner, and then the hearing examiner serves kind of as an auditor and audits the staff's work and makes an independent review of the file and a decision. And the public has opportunity to weigh in and provide testimony. A hearing is held, and it can actually really assist in trying to weed through the facts and the details. And ultimately, if it's going to end up in front of a hearing examiner on appeal anyway, whether it's an applicant appeal or a concerned citizen appeal, it's going to end up there anyway. So we might as well take it to the hearing examiner. So that was really all we were changing with regard to the UZDP, is making it from a type 2 to a type 3.
So when I was reading, thank you, because I may have misread this. So when I was reading under Planned Unit Development Standards 21.30.400, and then there's a bunch of bullet points, regulatory modifications, it's permit use in R1 through R8 zoning, and then it goes on to talk about regulatory modifications. And there's other, modifications to plan unit development, major modifications require new application. So there's a lot of this language. Am I just misreading that you're actually making modifications now to it? Because then you see how I'm a little confused now, because you're saying, no, we're only changing this.
So I think there's a simple answer here, and this may be our fault for how we packaged it. We looked at multiple ways to package tonight's agenda item for you. The issue is that the package that was originally presented to the Planning Commission for their consideration as part of their public hearing back in July included a plan unit development section that we had been working on with them. The Planning Commission found in review of the information in front of them, the proposed code changes, and in light of the commentary provided as part of the public hearing, they chose and found that the plan unit development section that we had originally proposed was not ready to be moved forward to the City Council and should be tabled as a future work item to be continued. So you'll see that there are two bundles of code in tonight's agenda bill for you. One bundle of code is attached to the Planning Commission recommendation, and
Correct.
that bundle of code includes the plan unit development section that the Planning Commission, as part of their recommendation, recommended be struck for your consideration, right? Then the second bundle of code is the section that the staff have put forward for the council for their review going forward, and it does not include the plan unit development section. So it's a really good question. I really appreciate you asking that, because we might have been able to clarify that a little more in the agenda bill, although at times these things become kind of murky in how we're moving forward. So just to be clear, there is no proposal at this point in time to move forward a plan unit development section. That is a future work item, and because of that, there are no amendments proposed to make modifications as you were identifying. That was part of the PUD section.
Thank you for the clarification. That definitely makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to jump the gun, Madam Mayor, but I then want to ask about the October 5th Joint Planning Commission meeting that's on our agenda. So should I just wait? Because I think some of the stuff that we're talking about that David Pyle and I are talking about right now, that's going to fall under this item 6 for discussion. Is that correct?
It could fall under that. However, at this point, just to be clear, the Planning Commission has made their recommendation on this, and it is in the council's arena at this point. Now, whether or not the council and the commission want to queue up a future work item for a plan unit development section that could be discussed at the retreat with the council in January, that is a matter of discussing that later tonight and possibly on October 5th. But for now, we are really focused on what was recommended by the Planning Commission in an effort to keep this moving forward.
Thank you, David Pyle. Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's all I have.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart? Okay. All right, then I just had a couple of, finishing up, I just wanted to do a couple of clarifications. One was on comments on the greenhouse gas emissions that were brought up. About 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions could be traced back to upscale home neighborhoods. I just wanted to put a perspective on this, that 10% of the world's wealthiest people make up 52% of the world's carbon emissions. I know I don't fit into that category, but I mean, just so that we can put some polls on what that is. So when we're thinking about those neighborhoods, just so that we're aware of what kind of neighborhoods we are talking about. And when they did this study that came up with that, the highest guzzling states were Maine, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And that was primarily because of the type of fuel that they were using primarily for heating and cooling their homes and the inefficiency of the homes that they had. So I just wanted to put some clarifications on that. Okay, so I wanted to, two of the things that were said, one was from Councilmember Odell, and I wanted to just make a point of, I totally agree with the, a concern with the 5-foot setbacks and how it relates to the firefighters and the response, because my concern is when they get those ladder trucks and stuff in there and not being able to get in between and getting at some of those houses, because when they're so tightly packed, I know they have a difficult time, and I know that they've had problems with the fires jumping, from one to the other. They had that problem, and I think it was either this summer or the summer before. So I want to make sure that we've thought about that when we're looking at the 5-foot setbacks and the houses being so close. And the other one was the comment of trees in the cul-de-sacs. I live in a neighborhood that is now coming up on 30 years old. And we have had trees that were put into each of the cul-de-sacs. And some trees that were good ideas and some that were not. But in all of the examples that we had the roots of those trees that then affected the roadways, because they started, as the roots spread out, they started damaging the roadways. So, keeping that in mind is we may want to be very cautious as we start trying to say that that's a good idea for having that as a requirement for them to put into those cul-de-sacs.
If I could add a clarification regarding the setbacks, just wanted to be clear that the only setback that is 5 foot within our code today is the setback for a detached accessory dwelling unit, which could be located that is less than 1,000 square feet in size and under 18 feet in height, could be located 5 feet from the rear or side yard. In all other cases, we're seeing a setback of greater than 5 feet being applied. It really depends on the size of the home, and we're not proposing to reduce that. So just want to be clear about that. The setbacks that were set as part of development regulations phase 1 that were adopted under ordinance 2019-482 in May of 2019 stand, and we're not proposing to change those setbacks. What we are proposing to do is add an enhancement of a floor to area ratio limitation for zones. It could be by zone, as was suggested here tonight. We could fine tune that, but right now it is set at 0.5, which would mean that for a 10,000 square foot lot, you could have a 5,000 square foot home. For a 4,000 square foot lot, you could have a 2,000 square foot home. And that is the volume of the home, whether it's 1 or 2 stories. There are some exceptions as to how that's measured, but I wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pyle. Okay, and I think we have one more. Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, could you repeat that statistic? That was an amazing statistic about the 52%, was it, you said, of the world's greenhouse gases?
10% of the world's wealthiest people make up 52% of the world's carbon emissions. And
that is, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a really important point to make. I know that it doesn't feel like it, but on a global scale, you only need a net worth of $93,000 to be part of the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. So I just want folks in Sammamish to recognize that if you have owned your home for more than, a couple of years, you probably have a net worth well over $93,000. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I do think that kind of just hits the point home that we need to really be looking at this, kind of from all perspectives. And trees are good. Trees help to keep things cool. They absorb carbon, but we have to look at how we reduce how much we're producing, because even if we planted trees on every square inch of Sammamish that doesn't have a house on it, we would not be able to sequester the amount of carbon that we are creating. And so I just think it's really important that we look at it. It's a balance. So there's a certain amount of trees we need, but there has to be a reduction in how much we produce. And we have to really look at taking serious proactive steps to be able to reduce how much greenhouse gases we produce. And that is the size of our homes, that's the materials of our homes, the insulation of our homes, that's our transportation, that's how we move around, that's where we get, what produces our electricity. And while, we are working as a state to improve our electricity, right now, PSE still produces much of its electricity from carbon plants out in, I believe it's Montana. So we still have a lot of work to do from all aspects. It has to be cleaner electricity. It has to be, getting rid of fossil fuels. Like, one of the things I'd love to see us do is stop putting fossil fuels in anything we build. And then also focusing on retrofit. So I love these development codes, and I think they're really important. But if we look at the number of homes we currently have in Sammamish compared to the number we're going to build in the future, we need to be looking at retrofit, right? We need to be looking at how do we go back and make the current homes and the current structures that we have today less damaging to our environment, quite frankly. So I think it's all of this. I think that the work that we've done here is great, but I do think we have a lot of work to do, and I really hope that going forward, the council puts a huge focus on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we have to look at it on a per capita basis. I think that's the most fair way and the most effective way for us to figure out how to reduce this overall. And so I really do appreciate you sharing that, because I think most people in Sammamish have a net worth of more than $93,000.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you got that number from, because the one that I pulled, the one in this article, reads over 500,000. So it's just a difference
I'm happy to share, because there's no way that you need to have $500,000 to be in the top wealthiest 10% in the world.
All right. So next is Councilmember Treen.
Sorry, did I not put my hand down? I apologize. So I'm good, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who had questions or? Okay.
Hey, just to jump in, could we get a break at some point?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, it's 9 o'clock. So let's take a Sammamish 5. And we'll be back here probably, let's see, it's 9 o'clock. We'll be back here at 10 after 9.
Thank you.
Okay, Council, we are back. And looking at the next thing that is on our agenda for this evening is discussion of the draft Balanced Land Use Mobility Analysis, BLUMA, the Environmental Impact Statement, the EIS. And this is Jeff. There he is. Good to see you.
Correct, Mayor. I'm going to try to share my screen now and start off with a brief few bullets, and then we have a pre-recorded video that we will run through. Let me know if that's come up.
It's up.
Thank
Good
you.
work, Jeff.
Thank you. So this is the kickoff. The city's consultant team for the Balanced Land Use and Mobility Analysis, fondly known as BLUMA EIS, is a recorded presentation overview of the draft EIS. That'll be before you in just a moment. Of note, the draft EIS was issued on August 26, 2021 for public review and comment. The comment period is scheduled to end on September 27, 2021 at 5 p.m. The final EIS is scheduled to be completed by March 2022. As a reminder, this is an informational presentation only, and no discussion will be held for this topic tonight. Pursuant to previous legal guidance, City Council members may provide comments as individual citizens, however, not as council members. Please refer to the email reminder sent by City Attorney to City Council a few weeks back, as well as sent out earlier today. Any interested party wishing to make comment on the draft EIS may further review the information in more detail on the Connect Sammamish project webpage at connect.sammamish.us/EIS. So with that, I will switch over to the presentation. I will put it in full mode and I will tell it to start.
Well, thank you for your interest in the Sammamish Balanced Land Use and Mobility Analysis. This slide presentation shares an overview of the proposals and the draft environmental impact statement that the city has issued for public comment. I'm Lisa Greeter. I'm a principal planner with Burke Consulting. We are the prime consultant on the environmental impact statement. I'll be sharing some of the process of the environmental impact statement and how you can comment and some of the early findings. I'm joined by our teammate from TSI. Victor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, I'm Victor Sailman with Transportation Solutions, Woodinville, Washington. I'm the lead transportation analyst for the EIS.
Thank you. First, we'd like to share the purpose of the proposals for transportation and land use in Sammamish and the purpose of the environmental impact statement. The proposal before the city consists of amendments to the Sammamish Comprehensive Plan and the Sammamish Municipal Code that are necessary to amend and implement the city's transportation level of service standards and concurrency management program. To help the city consider the best way to amend its plan and code, we've prepared an environmental impact statement, which is an informational document that's meant to help the city decision makers like the city council and the public understand what are the implications to the natural and built environment, and also to help the city identify a preferred alternative. We began the process with a scoping period last year in 2020. There was an opportunity for the public and agencies and tribes to provide comments on what should be the range of topics and alternatives studied in the environmental impact statement. In late August, the city issued the draft environmental impact statement and started a 30-day comment period that goes through the end of September. So that's where we're at in the middle of the process with the second round of comments, this time on the draft EIS itself. Once we have all the comments gathered, there will be a final environmental impact statement that will respond to those comments and also evaluate the preferred alternative. The draft EIS contents are based on the State Environmental Policy Act requirements, and it's organized to provide a summary, a description of the proposal and the alternatives, and then what are the implications to the environment, the potential impacts and mitigation measures. Within that chapter 3, we've covered a variety of natural environment topics like earth, water resources, plants and animals, as well as the built environment for land use, housing, consistency with plans and policies, transportation, and broadband utilities. And then there are other chapters or material that provide supporting information to the other chapters. The State Environmental Policy Act requires that an EIS share what are the objectives or purpose and need for the proposal. And those objectives are elements that the alternatives can be compared to. So we have 4 objectives here. One is to maintain consistency with all elements of the Sammamish Comprehensive Plan. A second is to manage transportation impacts associated with rapid growth, consistent with the comprehensive plan. A third one, to acknowledge and implement a transportation level of service that looks at real world conditions and its unique challenges, such as around how there's access to highways, what the topography is like, the commute patterns and conditions between intersections. And then the fourth is to employ land use measures that can reduce the demand for transportation trips and to maximize the network effectiveness. The proposal itself, as we mentioned, would result in changes to the comprehensive plan. So that would primarily include the transportation and capital facility elements and supporting material. And there may be some amendments made for consistency to other portions of the comprehensive plan. The amendments would also affect the Sammamish Municipal Code, and that could include Titles 14A, 20, 21A, and 21B that address definitions and transportation level of service standards and concurrency management and anything else that would be necessary to have consistency. So before the city, decision makers are a range of approaches that look at how you could set a transportation level of service and concurrency method. All alternatives are meant to address the city's growth targets to 2035 and intersection deficiencies. And the alternatives also look at a mix of intersection, segment, and land use and traffic demand management investments. So we'll share that range of alternatives that are meant to respond to those objectives and to help the city achieve the proposal to amend the plan and the code. So we have 4 alternatives that I'll touch lightly on here, and we'll have a slide on each of them. We have alternative 1, that is no action. That's a required alternative under the State Environmental Policy Act. Because we're looking out to 2035, it doesn't mean today's conditions, it means conditions as they are represented in the comprehensive plan, policies, and the code in effect at this time. And then we have alternatives 2, 3, and 4 that vary their approach to levels of service and include segments, and some also include land use and transportation demand measures. So first, again, alternative 1 is a continuation of transportation level of service standards and concurrency program requirements in effect. So it focuses in on intersection levels of service, and therefore the necessary improvements with growth anticipated to 2035 are just focused around 3 intersections. Alternative 2 would continue the intersection level of service standards, but also establish new level of service standards for key roadway corridors and segments. And in order to meet those segment levels of service, you can see some additional segment improvements identified, as well as the intersection improvements at various locations in the city. Alternative 3 is similar to alternative 2 by establishing segment levels of service as well as intersection levels of service, but it also assumes that more people will choose to work at home and reduce those peak hour trips on the network. It also looks at a blend of housing types in the town center that are currently allowed in the zoning code. It just assumes a certain balance of those housing types that tend to allow for a little bit fewer trips. And as a result, compared to alternative 2, there would be a different suite of segment improvements needed to meet this set of land use assumptions. An action alternative 4 is a more holistic look at what improvements could be made to meet the city's road standards and to focus investments at key corridors and segments. It includes all of the land use components of alternative 3 and the segment levels of service in alternative 2. But the combination of improving those key corridors to city standards and the land use measures results in a different location for those improvements. So having compared those alternatives, we want to share some of the results by different topics represented in the draft EIS. So first, in terms of natural environment, Because each of the alternatives have a different level of service standard and focus on intersection or segments, they have different resulting lengths of improvements and area of impervious surface. And that has different effects for the natural environment. All alternatives would result in construction that would have the potential to result in erosion and sedimentation. Some of those segment improvements could affect wetland or riparian buffers. Some improvements would require stream crossings, and some could occur in areas that have tree canopy. So while we understand there may be these potential impacts, there's a number of mitigation measures that can reduce those impacts. That includes critical area regulations, stormwater regulations, implementing public works standards, and complying with both local permits and state permits like hydraulic project approval, which affect how stream crossings are designed. In terms of the built environment, we look at the potential that the levels of service and concurrency programs could affect land use, housing, and plans and policies. And we look at a range of policies from the state, region, county, and local. And we consider what the effect of those improvements could be to the nature and type of housing and its affordability. In terms of utilities, we looked at the present extent of broadband internet, the usage of broadband internet based on local information and surveys, and the policies and codes that allow for unrestricted authority to provide telecommunication services to users. And we don't anticipate impacts as a result of those policies and situation, current extent and usage. Now I'd like to turn it over to Victor to talk about the transportation impacts.
Thank you, Lisa. So the alternatives were modeled using the city of Sammamish Zoom travel demand forecasting model. That's the same travel demand forecasting model that has been used for concurrency management and all other traffic analysis within the city. The various alternatives require different amounts of corridor improvements, as Lisa showed you on previous slides. Here we have a summary of those. Primarily, the amount of both motorized and non-motorized improvements that are required to meet the proposed level of service standards for each alternatives. Of interest primarily are the total roadway improvement miles, so that you can see from ranging from alternative 2 to 4, from 4.26 to 7.08 miles of new roadway improvements would be required. And then another feature that's interesting is lane miles improved. So that takes a look at how many miles of road require improvements, but how many miles of roadway are being widened. So you can see that alternative 2 has just under 6 new lane miles of capacity added. Alternative 3, a little more than 3.5 because of the reduced travel demand associated with alternative 3. And alternative 4 has the highest number of lane miles at over 13 because it's improving existing 2 and 3 lane roads to the city's 5-lane arterial standard as adopted in the 2016 Public Works standards. Sidewalks and bike lanes are included in those Public Works standards, and so for each roadway segment or corridor that's improved, we've added up the amount of bike lanes and sidewalk added. And so you can see corresponding to the number of roadway miles, we get a similar number of sidewalk and bike lane miles associated with each alternative. So we looked at 10 different transportation topics in the evaluation of the alternatives. Topics 1 and 2, I think you're familiar with, the current intersection level of service standard and the proposed corridor and segment to volume to capacity ratio standards. So each alternative projects are designed, in fact, to meet those standards. so they don't require mitigation to meet concurrency. They do meet concurrency. Topic 3, consistency with adopted local and regional roadway functional classifications. There's a section discussing functional classification. That's a description of the character and objectives of an individual roadway, with principal arterials being designed to carry the highest amount of traffic at the highest speeds, minor arterials to carry less traffic, provide more local access, and collector roadways to primarily collect traffic and feed arterials. In some cases, the projects required to meet the segment V over C standard were inconsistent with the roadway functional classification. Primarily the northern segments of East Lake Sammamish Parkway, classified as a minor arterial, required improvements that look more like principal arterial improvements. So we've identified those areas where the required improvements were not consistent with that regional roadway functional classification. And in some areas, similarly, Sahali Way or Issaquah Pine Lake Road, while functionally classified as principal arterials, had projects that look more like minor arterial projects on them. Topic 4, continuity with adjacent jurisdictions and facilities. This is where we looked at the interface between the city of Sammamish and its neighbors. And in some cases, the projects required to meet concurrency in the city were inconsistent with the existing roadways that they would be connecting to at those jurisdictional borders. And that's primarily at the border between Redmond and Sammamish on East Lake Sammamish Parkway, between Sammamish and King County on Sahali Way, and between Sammamish and Issaquah on Issaquah Pine Lake Road. We also looked at 6 different system-wide measures of effectiveness. I'll talk a little bit more about them on the next slide. They look at, rather than the performance of individual intersections or segments and corridors, they look at the system as a whole, and that can be beneficial to be understanding the improvements to the city as a whole from a combination of improvements. Transit mobility, each alternative was evaluated for the ability to support both motorized, non-motorized access to transit and the ability of transit to move through the city and provide service. Topic number 7, non-motorized mobility and safety. As I stated before, look primarily at the amount of new lane miles of bicycle and pedestrian facilities that would be added for each alternative, but also the continuity of those facilities. Would we be adding just pieces of bike lanes and sidewalks, or creating a continuous bicycle pedestrian network? Topic 8, freight mobility, looked at the ability of each alternative to serve the freight demand both throughout the city. Topic 9, evacuation and emergency response routes, looked at the impact of evacuation capacity primarily for each alternative. So those alternatives that added additional lane miles and capacity near higher density population areas were assumed to have better evacuation capacity than those that didn't. Similarly, the alternatives that provided more lane miles and roadway capacity provide additional emergency response routes and potentially lower emergency response times based on their improved speeds. And then topic 10, concurrency implications in terms of how each alternative would affect future development in terms of the amount of improvements necessary to meet concurrency. We can go to the next slide. So going to those system-wide measures of effectiveness, again, these can be very helpful, both in terms of traffic performance and in some environmental impacts as well. We looked at several measures, total trips. Those were the total trips modeled in the system, starting with the baseline in 2016. Alternative 1 and Alternative 2 have the same number of modeled trips. You can see the increase from the baseline conditions in 2016 resulting from the 2035 forecast growth. Alternative 3 shows the reduction in total trips modeled after the assumption of that 15% reduction in commute trips. And Alternative 4, as Lisa stated, has the same land use and same trip demand as Alternative 3. Vehicle miles of traveled, that takes the total number of trips and follows them through the network. And it's a good measure of how efficient the transportation network is. That's one of the city's transportation goals, is to have an efficient transportation system. And you can see how the total vehicles and miles of travel increased from 2016 and alternative 1. They decreased slightly for alternative 2, where we add some roadway segment capacity. Alternative 3 decreases significantly, and that's, you can see that's that 15% reduction in trip generation is being reflected in a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And then alternative 4, another slight reduction, and that's representing a more efficient travel path. That alternative 4 results in the same number of trips being shorter through the network because of the location of capacity improvements. Once we have that vehicle miles of travel, we can then compute 2 other measures of effectiveness. One is fuel consumption. So we estimate the gallons of fuel required to make that travel happen. And then knowing the fuel consumption, we can look at the environmental effect of greenhouse gas emissions from each of those alternatives. Average speed is one that goes to the idea of driver perception of how the system is working. And it's also very easy to understand. Of all these metrics, probably the most clear. You can see that we've created a chart of average speed on the upper right of the slide. So you can graphically see how existing conditions in 2016 had an average speed of over 32 miles an hour. Alternative 1 that does not provide corridor improvements or segment improvements results in a lower average speed throughout the city. Alternative 2 provides some transportation improvements that increase that average speed almost to 2016 baseline levels. Alternative 3 shows the effect of reduced travel demand with that 15% commute reduction. That actually gets us to peak hour average speeds higher than the 2016 baseline. And then alternative 4 shows how putting the projects or improvements in different areas more aligned with where people want to travel and providing higher capacity results in even higher average speeds than the 2016 baseline. And then similarly, the last row in the table is the total delay, a little more abstract than speed, but also shows how many hours of delay drivers in the city would experience for each alternative.
Thank you, Victor. Now we'll give you more information on how you can comment and what are some of the next steps. Our comment period started on August 26th and it goes through 5 p.m. on September 27th. You can provide written comments at the address listed on the slide or by the email address eis@sammamish.us. There's also a comment form at the link shown on the slide. The city is going to select a preferred alternative in the range of the studied alternatives of the draft EIS. And graphically, we've shown here that following the draft EIS comment period, there will be a review of the comments and the city will develop a preferred alternative. That preferred alternative will be studied in the final environmental impact statement. And as I mentioned earlier, all the comments will be provided a response in the final EIS. Tips for commenting, summarizing your concerns and being specific about pages or topics. You can identify where we can make the information more complete or accurate, identify possible solutions, including mitigation measures, and the best combination of alternative features for the city to consider in a preferred alternative. This is an opportunity for you to affect many future projects, identify mitigation of potential impacts, and alternatives that best meet those objectives. So again, here's the links that you can go to review the draft environmental impact statement. And the comment period concludes at 5 p.m. on September 27th. And you can provide that by to the email address or at that form at the link below. So thank you for your time and interest, and we look forward to seeing your comments.
Thank you. And that's really hard to sit there and listen to that and not have a bunch of questions, by the way. Okay, so next up we have got permit fee analysis overview. And that is with David Pyle. And do I see him up on the screen? I do. Mr. Pyle.
Yeah, good evening, Council. Again, David Pyle, Community Development Department. Tonight we have Miriam Leitner and Sarah Esteri from the Community Development Department with Matrix Consulting, who has been assisting us in analyzing our department's structure and the revenues that we collect, and has a presentation for you on some of their initial findings and some recommendations for discussion with the council. With that, I'll turn it over to Courtney with Matrix, who is here and has her video feed on. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Here we go. All right, let's see. Can everybody see this? Okay, I got a thumbs up from David. I'm feeling good.
We got it.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time this evening. My name is Courtney Ramos. I'm with Matrix Consulting Group, and we were tasked with doing a fee analysis for the city. Quick little tidbit about Matrix Consulting Group. We are a national consulting firm that works with local government, not only on cost of service and fee analysis, but also on process, efficiency, and staffing for development services. So planning, building, fire prevention, public works, things of that nature. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you about this study and give you kind of an overview of what we're doing and a little preview as to the topics that you'll be asked to think about and to make decisions on when we come back to you in November. So starting off of just a kind of a brief overview of the fee analysis. What it does is it documents fee-related services. It documents the service level assumptions that go into those services, and it details the full cost of providing those services, so the direct and the indirect costs. The key benefits and uses for this, it streamlines your fee schedule. So we get rid of all of those outdated fees that have just kind of been sitting on the fee schedule. We incorporate new fees or new services that we're now providing. We make it clearer for the applicant as well as for staff to kind of administer that fee schedule. We ensure compliance with state and local laws. We make sure that the way that we're charging things, the way that we've costed things out, are in compliance. We identify the full cost of associated with those fee-related services. So again, kind of letting you understand what it actually costs the city to process those permits, to approve those applications. And it also outlines staffing resources that are required to provide those fee-related services. So kind of taking a look at, are you meeting key benchmarks for turnaround times when you're processing applications? So the general process of this fee study, like I said, we start by developing the fee structure. So making sure that it's reflecting the current services that you're providing today. So making sure that how we provide those services is accurately reflected in the way that we're charging those fees. So if it needs to be per acre or per lot, that we're using fees that, like I said, are reflecting how you're providing those services to the applicant. We're establishing and confirming time estimates so that we can account for service levels associated with those types of processes. We don't want to think about extraordinarily simple or complex projects when we're looking at time estimates. We want to think about what is the average amount of time that it takes us hands-on. So not it's a 3-month turnaround time, but how much time are we actively spending on that project on average for each one of those services. We look at developing fully burdened hourly rates so that, again, we can account for both direct costs as well as indirect costs associated with that. So the direct costs are obviously the salary and benefits of the staff we're touching. the applications, and the indirect costs are associated with support staff or citywide overhead, things like finance and HR, services that are required to help those staff do the job that they're there to do. And then also evaluating current staffing and processes, ensuring that minimum service levels and cycle times are met. Are we doing this as effectively and efficiently as we can be doing it compared to other benchmarks for permitting and processing, as well as identifying options for improvement? Can we be better at what we're doing? Not just in order to meet identified goals, but if we have greater ideas for what our service level should be. So we put together kind of initial cost recovery findings. We're still in the middle of the study. So we're still kind of, looking at numbers and things like that. But if we take a real high level overview and we look at the expenditures associated with planning and with building, and we look at the revenue that they've generated, it looks like building has about a 76% cost recovery and planning has about 66% cost recovery. Typically, the cost recovery level that we see for building is anywhere between 80 to 100%, while planning is typically between 50 and 80%. And so obviously, anytime we have less than 100% cost recovery, that means that taxpayers are subsidizing those services. We're not recovering enough through our fees to pay for that, and the alternative funding source for that is typically tax revenue. So when we start to think about how we set fees and where we set fees and how we recover those costs, it's kind of important to look at the benefit continuum. And on one end, we have kind of this global community benefit, right? So we have things like police services, park maintenance, and fire suppression. And those are typically services that we see that are fully funded through tax revenues, sometimes some grant resources as well. And in the middle, we have, this global benefit, but also an individual or a private benefit. And those would be things like recreation services or fire prevention. And those definitely have a strong mixture of tax dollars, user fees, and other funding like grants. And then we have things that are individual or private benefit. So like a building permit, planning and zoning application, site plan review, engineering review. And those are typically fully funded by user fee revenues. So again, when we start to look at cost recovery and cost of service, and we identify what we want to do, we need to think about things in that benefit continuum, right? Where do we think our services should fall? The other kind of key thing to look at is going to be the service delivery options. What we want to do with this study is make sure that our standard level of service, our current level, is meeting, staffing and processes and established turnaround times. If we're saying it should take 3 months to process an application, we want to make sure that we're meeting or exceeding those timelines. We also want to make sure that those timelines are consistent with what we see in other jurisdictions. But other options that we do have through this study is to take a look at and say, if we're meeting that standard, do we want to have a higher standard? Do we want to have additional services in our baseline fees? Do we want to look at, increased turnaround times? Do we want a marquee service where we're expediting the service and we're turning things around? And also looking at what would that take? Can we do that with the staffing level that we have? Do we need to increase staff in order to meet that service level? So again, kind of what are the service levels that we want to have? What's the type of service that we want to provide to our customer base, to the applicants? And what would it take to provide those services? So to kind of just sum up for you guys, what we're going to come back to you with in November and ask you to think about and to decide will be 4 key things. One, what kind of service level do you want? If we want to have a higher service level, if we want to have quicker turnaround times, if we want to have faster response times for answering emails and phone calls and things like that, what is our service level? What do we want it to be? Because that service level will directly impact the cost of the service. So once we know that, then we can take a look at developing cost recovery goals. So once we know the service that we want, we know the cost associated with that service, then we can take a look at it and say, what portion of that cost do you as the council feel that the applicant should have to pay versus what should be funded by other sources, i.e. property taxes? Then we want to look at outlining timelines to achieve those cost recovery goals. So, for something like planning, which might have a lower cost recovery, how quickly do we want to get to our goal? Do we want to implement it, January 1, July 1? Do we want to take a couple years to get there? So what's the timeline that we want to utilize in order to achieve the goals that we've set? And then finally, what we want to do is make sure that we establish an automatic increase mechanism. So if we've gone through all this effort to identify what the cost of service is and to create these cost recovery goals, we don't want to leave our fees stagnant year after year because then we're no longer achieving our goals because our costs are increasing year after year. So making sure that we establish a mechanism so that we can increase our fees annually so that if nothing else, we're maintaining that cost recovery. It's increasing at the same rate that our base costs, our salary and benefits are increasing. And so when we're done with this study, we'll be providing a report to the council that will provide all of this information back to you, that will show you the various different service levels, that'll show you the cost of service. It'll also give you a comparison to other jurisdictions for key fees and applications so that you can understand what those service levels could mean from a cost perspective in comparison to other surrounding and neighboring jurisdictions. And with that, I will open it up for questions and or turn it back over to David.
Thank you, Courtney. I'll turn it over to the mayor. Really appreciate the presentation. Really well done. Thank you.
Okay, so I did have one quick question, and I'm looking here to see if I have. Let me look at my chat. So the other, I had one quick question, and maybe you can. When was the last time that these were addressed? When's the last time that any sort of study was done on? And looked at, when's the last time any sort of study was done on these, on the fees?
So we have not, as far as I'm aware, done this type of study as a city. We have done a cost increase analysis where we've gone through and reset our fee schedule, if you will. However, we have not had a earnest discussion about what it means to have different levels of service and what the cost is for that. DCD is faced with what I call a long-running perennial turnover of staff. And one of the main reasons for that is because of what we see as an expectation for a level of service and a lack of staff to actually deliver that level of service. The biggest problem we have is the cost of onboarding and training new employees and the loss of institutional knowledge that goes with departures of staff. One of the primary reasons cited when we deliver exit interviews for staff is that we are an under-resourced department. That's also coupled with another reason, which is that most people who work in our department don't live in Sammamish and actually have long commute times. So we're trying to do two things here. Is we're trying to, number one, make sure that we are a properly resourced department and that our customer service level expectations are accounted for in our staffing, so we don't lose staff as a matter of burnout. And number two, we are looking, as you're aware, at a permanent telecommute program where we're able to allow staff some flexibility in the location of where they work, because we've proven that that can work with COVID. So that's really what spurred this, and we welcome further comment and are looking forward to having a good conversation with the council about this.
Okay, so we haven't done any sort of analysis or anything since that you know of. When's the last time we've raised our fees or anything in this on any of the?
So we do annually adopt a fee schedule.
Okay.
And with the adoption of the fee schedule, there are increases that are added. So the fees have gone up, but we have not looked at the actual cost of delivering the service and comparing that to what the fees are, and looking at what we want, deliberately looking at what we want to have as a cost recovery.
I did think it was very interesting that you're seeing such a flip from people coming in and having a builder come in and do it versus having them come in themselves, because I can see where that takes so much more time. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so we have some other hands up. So Councilmember Odell.
Thank you, Karen. David, great presentation. I've got a couple of thoughts on it. One is there any interest in differentiating between customers who are actual residents of the city who have maybe a short plant they want to do versus people who are non-residents? And I'm not sure what pitfalls would be present if we took that approach. I wonder if it's something we want to think about, because I think in the parks area, we do differentiate between residents and non-residents for facility uses. Second of all is, well, I fully agree we need to get a better handle on the cost of delivering each of these individual products, if you will. What will the study cost us?
So the study is already budgeted for. It's something that was included in the department's work plan and included in the 2021-2022 budget. I can't recall offhand. I'd have to ask Sarah or Miriam to remind us of what the value of the contract was in this case. I just simply can't remember offhand. Like I said before in the development regs thing, I can't remember numbers, so I apologize.
It's about $39,000.
$39,000 for the contract.
Okay, thank you.
And with regard to differentiating between residents and outside developers, if you will, I'm curious, Courtney, if you've ever seen that in a fee schedule where, similar to how parks might provide a discounted rate for residents as compared to non-residents, if you've seen that in development permits.
I've actually never seen that in development permits. Really common in Parks and Rec, but never in development permits. I'm not sure. I would actually question the legality of being able to do that. But it certainly is possible. I mean, you could do commercial versus residential. I think it's certainly something we could look into, but it would be a first. It is definitely not something I've ever seen.
Okay, Courtney, thank you for that answer. I was concerned about the legal issues as well, but I was thinking of primarily residential versus commercial. And I'm after the fellow who, interested in the fellow who maybe has an R1 property and he wants to subdivide into R4, that type of thing. Versus a property owner who does a bunch of acquisitions and builds a large parcel for a bigger development, or for someone who simply wants to, put in an ADU or that type of thing.
There's a lot of different ways to kind of structure that in the fee schedule so that you're able to kind of get full cost recovery on something like a commercial project versus if it's a kitchen remodel or a bath remodel, or like you said, an ADU in your backyard. That you can set cost recovery levels lower for those types of projects, so that you don't just kind of blanket and say everything is 100% cost recovery, that you kind of look at it kind of project by project or application by application.
Well, the theory here is the residents of Sammamish are already paying part of the bill, so.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Ross.
Thank you. At first glance, you look at the percentage of recovery and it looks like it's benchmarking well, but what I'm hearing is we're not meeting the level of service right now. So that would imply that we would have to add more people, cost, which actually would lower those percentages to bring it up to an adequate level of service. Is that a fair statement?
I wouldn't say that you're not at the standard level right now. I think we're still looking at that through this study. But I wouldn't say that you're not meeting kind of standard turnaround times or standard levels of service. Now, standard meaning across the board. Now, if it's up to kind of what you think standard should be in Sammamish, that could be a different story. But you're absolutely right. If you wanted to have a higher level of service, that would create more cost, and then that would reduce that cost recovery level.
Okay, so right now we think we are meeting, but it's kind of contradicts what David, what you were saying is we're having trouble staffing, but we're still meeting the level of service. Is that's what I want to pin down.
Yeah, so we've had one rolling vacancy in planning, if you will, that we've been working on filling, and then we fill that, and then we see another departure, and then we work on filling that, and the impact that has on our ability to deliver at that level. And in part, it's part due to the vacancy, but it's also in part due to the expectation on the part of the customer that we deliver a level of service that we're not really designed to deliver. And as Mayor Moran indicated, we've seen a change in our customer base, whereas in the past we used to have professional developers who had dedicated staff who were knowledgeable on local rules and knew how to apply for a permit and knew how to design a home and knew how to work through all the issues that go along with permitting. Now we're seeing individual homeowners who are the primary contractors, if you will, who are pursuing permits, who are managing their contractors, calling for inspections, and what's happening there is that's placing an additional demand on staff time, because we're having to explain with more detail what is needed of the applicant as compared to the past when it was a professional developer who was doing the project. And on the flip side to that is you've seen a change in the level of expectation for whatever reason on government in our ability, or in the expectation of response times. So we typically see, we receive an email, and if we don't reply that same day, that afternoon, the applicant will call us. And then if we don't call them back, they'll call us again first thing in the morning, and then email us maybe twice the next day. And then if we don't reply the next day, they'll email council members, and they'll say staff are being unresponsive. And the issue here then is that then council members look into it, and that then triggers a whole another amount of time that we're having to spend looking into it, when in fact the staff person is just really busy and booked and doesn't really have the ability to keep up with the 1 or 2 emails a minute that come into their email box. So it's really a challenge for us to keep up with it. If we want to deliver that level of service to the community, we can do it, but we're going to need more staff. On the flip side, if the council is aware of this, then and if we wanted to deliver a lower level of service, I'm not saying the council wants to do that, we might need to advertise on our website that we will respond to emails within 2 business days, that kind of thing, just to be very transparent about what that level of service is. We're just wanting to get it right for the community and wanting to know from the council what their expectation is with regard to that level of service that we provide to the community. And then, if we are going to provide a higher level of service, how do we pay for it?
So once we establish the level of service, then we're going to find ourselves short of recovery, 100% recovery. And I do see that one pathway is increasing rates. The other pathway is improving efficiency. Is there part of this effort have process improvement efforts in it to actually improve the efficiency, lower the cost of those working these permits?
Yeah, so part of taking a look at the staffing is looking at, the staff that you have, the workload that you have, and are you able to meet, like I said, key turnaround time metrics. And then looking at that process and saying, is there a way that we could be more efficient with this? So example, if I'm, and this is just an example, but if I'm walking plans over to Public Works, and then I walk it over to building, and then I walk it over to planning, right? Versus if I just send it out to everybody at the same time, right? That takes less time. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at is there a way to make that process more efficient? And then as part of that, if those are recommendations, certain recommendations, we could say, if you just tweak this, right, we can make it more efficient, and thereby we can reduce the cost. There are other recommendations that we will also look into that could cut down on time. So for example, we could look at something that maybe has, takes a planning commission level review. And if we look at the type of application it is, and maybe it's something that could be changed to be an administrative or a director level review, that's going to take significantly less time if I don't have to put together that staff report, if I don't have to present to the Planning Commission. But a change like that, you know, a process improvement, so to speak, like that, might take changing your code. It might take altering what those authority levels are. So it might take a little bit long implement that change, that process efficiency. But those are definitely the types of things that we are going to look at. And if they are possibilities, bring those up and provide recommendations relating to that.
Thank you, Courtney and David.
So just to add on to that, we have also done multiple improvement projects leading up to this point. We've changed how we intercept and handle customers when they're seeking information about their property. You'll see in tonight's with tonight's agenda, there was a comment submitted by Mary Wichter regarding the use of project guidance process that we developed, and we've really streamlined how we handle customers on the front end. We've also created standard operating procedures. I know that that's one of the things that's painful for our staff when they have to write down every step of what they do, and we've analyzed those steps and look for linear ways to streamline that. It's a constant effort for us for process improvement, but we definitely look forward to those suggestions that Matrix can provide us in trying to look outside the box of things we haven't tried.
Great, thank you.
Okay, council members, I don't see any more hands, but before we move on, we need to extend the meeting.
Madam Mayor, I move to extend the meeting to 11 o'clock.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Do we lose City Hall?
No, we're all probably thinking, why are we extending it so long?
Yeah, we shouldn't need to, but that way we've got coverage. So, okay, so we have to. We have a motion on the floor. So all those in favor, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Excellent. Okay, do we have any more questions for?
Yeah. Karen, I had one question.
Okay.
Or not question so much as a suggestion. David, could we not put an automatic reply on inbound messages that will give the sender an idea of when they will hear back? I feel like if we're going to have 48-hour turnaround standard, we can put that down. That might eliminate some of the back and forth we were talking about.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Definitely, we'll implement that one. I have a staff meeting coming up, and I'll talk to the staff about that tool. That's one that is often overlooked. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Sure.
Okay. I don't have anything else. I don't see any other hands, so that's perfect. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Okay, the next thing up is the discussion for October 5th Joint Planning Commission.
Yep. Mayor Moran, David Pyle, Community Development again. I am here tonight.
You're just a busy guy this evening.
I am. I am going to attempt to share my screen with you. There we go. There it is. See, there it is. And one more click, and I'm here. And I just have a real basic presentation for you regarding the October 5th, 2021 City Council agenda. Currently, the October 5th meeting is scheduled as a joint City Council Planning Commission meeting. Current agenda items on the draft agenda include community visioning, which is a DCD project, the 2022 comp plan dockets, a discussion regarding the status of the Issaquah High-Low campus, school impact fees, connecting Washington funds, which is a public works discussion, grant opportunity for a housing action plan, which is DCD, the Lewis Thompson Road project overview, et cetera. What we are proposing is breaking this into two meetings, a joint City Council Planning Commission meeting that would possibly be an early start running from 5:30 to 7 or thereabouts, and would include an opening conversation between the City Council and the Planning Commission. It would include a discussion on community visioning project that the city is currently working on, and it would include the 2022 comp plan docket requests. Then the City Council would reconvene for their regular business meeting without the Planning Commission, and that meeting would run from 7:30 to 10:30 or until adjournment. And the agenda for this would include items that are unique to City Council business that would not be appropriate to include the Planning Commission on. So there are two options, and we're looking for City Council direction. Should we break the evening into two meetings? Should there be an early start? Are there any other comments or suggestions? And what is the City Council direction on this?
Can you go back to the previous slide, David?
This slide here.
Yeah, that one. Well, let's see. The one before that, too.
The one before that. This one?
Yeah. All right, thanks.
So open to comments from the council, looking for some direction.
Well, I think that's an awful lot to cover in one joint meeting with them, if we've got anything else on there.
You got hands up, Karen.
Oh, okay, Deputy Mayor?
Thanks. I don't think we can see David's screen anymore where he had the options that he was kind of looking for feedback on. If we can. There we go. So you'd asked something about starting the meeting early on one of the things. This says starting at 5:30 or two meetings.
Here we go. So yeah. So yep.
So the early start question, I think I guess I would end up, it's going to be challenging to start a meeting at earlier, at least on my part. I don't know if, and I can't speak for others. I don't know if others will have a challenging time, but yeah, it's going to be hard for me to start early. But it is a lot of weighty material to get into. And so I do fear that if we don't start early, that it might need to be broken into two meetings to cover the subject matter, because here we are in a study session and we had to extend that one. So I imagine that subject material might need to be covered between two different meetings if the Planning Commission and staff are willing to kind of bifurcate it.
So under that proposal, there would be two joint meetings with the Planning Commission spread across 2 evenings?
Yeah, because I think, council will still have other business to attend to that doesn't involve the Planning Commission, and there's no sense in tying them up until 11 p.m., midnight, or whatever it ends up being. Because otherwise, if we try and plow through all of this subject matter and then deal with regular business, we're going to have one really, really late night.
Agreed, which is why we were looking at the 5:30 start, but we do understand the attendance issues. Everyone has their own lives and commitments that they have to account for. So the reason why there are these 3 items that we felt would be appropriate for a separate joint meeting that is specific to a discussion between the Planning Commission and the City Council is, number one is we're always interested in trying to find ways to improve communication between the Planning Commission and the Council. I think we've made a lot of headway in this area, and we just want to make sure that the Planning Commission is in tune with the expectations of the council, in assisting them in doing some of the vetting of policy that is to come to the, to the review of the council at a later date, right? We want to make sure that the Planning Commission is aware of the interests of the council. The second is the community visioning project that we have discussed with the council in the past when we were looking at approving the contract with OTAC. And what this is an update on the project. It's what we're working on. We will be bringing forward a draft of the survey that will go out, the statistically valid survey for final comment by council, just to make sure we got it right. We also wanted to include the Planning Commission on this because the Planning Commission does do a lot of work in assisting the council with visioning, with analyzing the current vision, looking for any ways we might want to improve it. And the Planning Commission also will be instrumental in our upcoming comprehensive plan update. So we want to make sure they're included in any early conversations around community visioning so that the council can provide direction to the commission on that. Finally, we have the 2022 comprehensive plan docket requests. And this is something that we feel would be good for overlap between the Planning Commission and the council, because we do have to present this to both bodies, and it's actually more efficient for us to present it to both the Planning Commission and the council together, so that number one, it could possibly initiate some conversation between the two bodies about the docket process and about what might be appropriate items to include. And number two, it allows us to only have to deliver that once and have that meeting once. So it does help us streamline our calendars as well. If the council wanted to, you could choose to only include one of these items for that meeting that evening, and we could refine the agenda that way. You could choose to include only community visioning, or you could choose to only include the comp plan docket requests. If I had my recommendation, it would be to only include the community visioning if you were to eliminate one of those items. Thank you.
Thanks, David. As a side note, as I talk here, I mean, I'm one of, 7 council members. And then of course there's a bunch of planning commissioners. So, just because I might be challenged by the 5:30 start certainly doesn't eliminate the meeting from starting early. And frankly, the ability to call in remotely because of Zoom. So that's all I had, Karen.
Okay, we're going to go to Councilmember Treen.
Yeah, I can start early, and I'm okay for splitting it up. So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, David, I like the splitting it up. I think the way you've split it out makes sense. I would share Christy's concern that I think the regular council meeting agenda that's left over might be a little ambitious. But I'm assuming we could adjust that as needed. And like Christy, I would be challenged to start at 5:30. So I would say that we should just adjust the scope of the meetings accordingly. But I like what you have on the agenda for the joint meeting, and trying to have a singular joint meeting is probably best because that's a little more coordination of a lot of people. So that would be my preference. Thanks.
Councilmember Odell.
The unmute button keeps disappearing from my screen, so pardon me. I'm going to chime in too, and I think this is way too ambitious for one meeting. I would be in favor of adding a special meeting on the 28th of September to deal with one of these two sections here. I think both are important, both need to be discussed, and we need to have time to have a quality discussion of them. I don't think by adding a fourth meeting, we're creating any more staff work, because what we're doing is just splitting a large meeting in two. it also gives us the flexibility to handle something that may come up unexpectedly. Just as an aside, in a bygone era, the mayor and the deputy mayor used to meet monthly or even quarterly with the chair and vice chair of the planning commission to actually help the liaison issue we're talking about here. It didn't involve everybody, but at least the sense of the council and the sense of the planning commission got exchanged, and I think it ran fairly smoothly. I don't want to add to the workload of anybody, but this is another option too for improving communications in the future without having to involve the entire planning commission and the council in additional meetings. Thank you.
Councilmember Gamblin?
Yeah, I'm good with whatever works for the group. I can start early, and if we want to split it and we determine that works best, that's fine also.
Councilmember Ross?
I'm good with all alternatives suggested so far.
Okay, and I think it's a lot for one night. I'd be okay with starting at 6. I think 5:30 is kind of tough on anybody who's got a work schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But 6 o'clock I think might work. I think it's a little ambitious for one evening, but if we started at 6, it might be doable. That's my 2 cents worth.
So if there are no more immediate comments from council, one of the suggestions I have is that we started at 6 and that we eliminate one of the items. We could eliminate the docket requests and we could include that at a separate meeting to be scheduled at a different time. So what we'll be doing is starting at 6, including a joint conversation between the council and the planning commission to start off the meeting. And then we'll go ahead and include the visioning as the primary point of discussion, as I think that is really foundational to all the work we do between the elected body, the appointed body, and the staff. And it is also something that is we're wanting to invest time in to help us with our upcoming comp plan update, because we feel that this is really one of the most pivotal moments for the city in updating our comp plan. We want to get that conversation started.
Okay.
Hey, Karen.
Yes, Councilmember Stewart.
One thing we might think about is that we put the docket items on there as tentative, and depending on how quickly the visioning piece goes, if we have time. And the only reason I throw that out, and David, this would be completely up to you, is that it sounded like being able to present this to the council and the planning commission jointly would actually save you guys time. And so we just had a presentation where you just told us, you guys are spread too thin. And then you said, if we can do this together, we'll save ourselves some time. So I want to try to be flexible to try to help you guys be more efficient. So we could put it on as tentative if things go quickly, and allow you potentially that option of being more efficient. Now, if that is harder for you guys because it's tentative and you got a plan and then it doesn't happen, then I don't want to do it. It's only if you feel like it would be better or beneficial to you guys.
So perhaps we could plan on starting at 6 and roll through 7:30, and we're confident as staff that we can get through that initial conversation, that we can get through the visioning. It's a presentation on the status of it. It's not a real detailed conversation. It's really just sort of a primer for what's to come. And then finally, it would be a presentation on the docket requests, which we can get through. There are not many this year. So that's positive for this meeting's agenda. And then we would plan on wrapping up at 7:30, and then we would roll over into the regular business meeting that would start at 7:30.
Okay.
And some of the discussion that happens even on the docket request doesn't have to happen jointly, right? Your presentation could be a joint one, and if we need to talk about it more, at a later meeting, we can still do that, right? So that way you can still get some of your efficiencies in of only having to present it once. And then if there's follow-up, we could do that. If that's more, again, only if you feel like that's more efficient for you.
Well, there will be follow-up, because what ends up happening is the Planning Commission has to hold a public hearing on the docket, and then the Planning Commission makes recommendation to the City Council, who ultimately then holds a public hearing on the docket, and chooses to ultimately which items to move forward. So what this does is it provides us opportunity to present it to both bodies, ask for any questions. The Planning Commission can hear commentary provided by the council and help inform their decision-making. And then that ultimately leads to a more efficient process down the line between the two bodies and with staff.
I like that plan if that works for everybody else. Just trying to find that happy medium.
No, I think that's a good call.
I agree.
Yep. Yep, good call.
We'll go ahead and put the wheels in motion unless you hear any objections.
Nope, good call.
So hearing none, we'll close this topic.
Okay, excellent.
David's like, I'm running away now.
Yeah.
Hey, Karen, can we look for something to take out of the agenda that's not related to this? Like maybe forego a couple proclamations this time? Just for the interest of time.
Well, I can go back and I can review. I'll go after the meeting. I'll go and I'll look at the agenda with Dave, and we'll see what we can look at. We'll see what we can pull. Okay.
Because if it's something we can roll a couple of weeks, let's do it.
Okay. That'd be perfect. I'll take a look. Okay. So, yep, Dave, you're done. Excellent. Okay. So the next up is our public comment this evening. And pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-28, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual City Council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and public comment is able to be submitted. Written public comment will be accepted until 5 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Submit your written comments by email to the City Clerk, lhatchie@sammamish.us, and the City Council at citycouncil@sammamish.us. Verbal comment, please join the Zoom meeting if you would like to give verbal public comment. Information on how to join is listed under Meeting Accessibility at the top of the agenda. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lita.
I will now ask all those attendees that would like to give public comment to raise your hand, please. I see that there are 2 people that have raised their hand. I will now unmute the callers in the order that they have raised their hands. When it's your turn to speak, I will convert you to a panelist, and you'll be unmuted and have an opportunity to turn on your webcam. You will have 3 minutes to provide comment. Please note, during this conversion, it will feel like you are being removed from the meeting, but please wait a few seconds and you will return. For attendees who are joining by phone, please raise your hand by pressing *9. 15 seconds before your 3 minutes is complete, I will provide a time warning. At 3 minutes, you will be muted and converted back to an attendee. Please start your comment by stating your name and the city you live in for the record. I will now unmute the first caller.
Yes, and it's me, James Eastman. I'm probably me and Mary, the only ones crazy enough to stay on this long, but wish I had something funny to say, but I read through the 1,000-page EIS and I think it sucked the life out of me. And really, my whole opinion on that thing is based off of 2 single lines. I go to 2 lines in the study and have based an entire opinion. And maybe I hope I'm wrong, but I want to pretend I'm Pan Stewart going home from work. I know she constantly talks about how she can either go straight or take East Lake Sammamish Parkway. So I'm guessing that's the case. Right now, if she wants to go on East Lake Sammamish Parkway, she's one of 1,200 vehicles that goes down that road per hour. And that's pretty much remained somewhat constant over the years due to the no right turn on red there at that light. There's crosswalks. But in our EIS, it says basically alternate 4, it looks great. We're going to go improve Sahali Way. And all of a sudden, East Lake Sammamish Parkway is going to go from 1,200 vehicles down to 800 vehicles. But yet you read the 202 study, and it says that the commute time along that 4-mile segment is going to go up 11 minutes from East Lake Sammamish Parkway to Sahalee. It's going to go up 11 minutes. And really the only solution they had in that 202 study was to put a slip lane at East Lake Sammamish Parkway from the 202, which means you're going to unload a stream of cars on the East Lake Sammamish Parkway. But we're saying it's going to go down by 400 vehicles, and it will magically pass concurrency at 1.10, right under the 1.11 limit. So my faith in the EIS based off of just that one line of data alone has me somewhat disappointed when we know if we flood the parkway, that 1,200 number is going to go way up, probably to 1,700 vehicles, because you've put a through slip lane in and nobody wants to wait 11 minutes. So that's the way they're going to go home. So it doesn't really matter how many lanes you put on Sahalee Way. Nobody's going to go that way if it's quicker on the parkway, which brings me back. I was in the meeting 4 years ago. I was rambling on about something, but Tom Hornish said, hey, first 20 minutes of every meeting, we're going to talk about traffic. Here we are 4 years later. We haven't really stayed, with that method. We haven't really
15 seconds.
TMP, the TIP. We went through this, and I feel like it's T8 all over again. Let's just be honest. Let's talk about the money. If we don't have the money to do Sahalee Way, if we don't have the money to do East Lake Sammamish Parkway, let's call it in this EIS and talk about what we do have the money to do and what we.
We now unmute caller number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Eastman.
Hi, this is Mary Wichter. I think I'm unmuted now. And I've lived in the city of Sammamish 20 years. I just wanted to talk on 2 things on the Phase 2 development regulations. First of all, great consultants, fantastic work by staff, really strong planning people, a lot of changes, a lot of input, many meetings, really terrific. It is important to look at how big a house you're putting on a lot, where the lot is, where the trees are, context sensitive. Are you next to somebody smaller than you, bigger than you, and all that stuff. Unfortunately, some of the things as they're implemented are only going to apply to large developments and maybe not even to small plats or short plats, and not to single family homes, whether they're in a development and they just were developed later, or single family homes that are on an existing lot and might be remodeled, redeveloped, or re-subdivided, and not to critical area lots. So I think we need to make sure as many of those really great concerns on everything apply to every single project. We have 21,000 housing units, and all those could redevelop at some point. And we're working with over 20-year-old code, and it takes forever. You've heard from me for 6 years to get changes, and we need as many of those to apply to many types of development that we can. And then the second thing is on the fee analysis. I did send in a written email. The project guidance stuff that the city staff came up with has just been fantastic. You have to type more than 30 words. You can get response back in 5 business days. They tell you what applies. They tell you even if you don't need a permit, you still need to look at the code. They give you feedback on what to do. There's mybuildingpermit.com. When you get a project guidance, it comes back as a feasibility with the year 2021 and a 6-digit number. It gets recorded on your parcel so people will know what you've looked into. It's just a really good thing to use. So I gave you some example slides from that. If you haven't ever done that, I did that for my own house this year in one situation. The really important thing is how to recover. There's a gap if you've done something bad or prior illegal situations, if you've overgraded, clear and graded, or if there's been a permit or not, or a code violation, or whether fines are paid or not. There are things that sit for 5, 10, 15 years, which is really unacceptable. This includes earth, vegetation removal, grows back with weeds and nothing else, doesn't help anybody or the environment. Trees get removed without permits, even if they're reported, nothing's done. There needs to be a way to make sure those are really enforced and that you get things done. And on drainage, if you aren't doing a project, you don't have to look for a drainage review or threshold, so it won't get triggered. And for one example, Sammamish Plateau Water did a smoke testing study. They have found things like houses where their downspouts and roofs are connected to the sewer system, that's wastewater sanitary sewer. That is not legal. They will need to be removing that stormwater and putting it somewhere
15
else.
seconds.
That is not going to trigger a permit. It needs to trigger a permit, or you need to look at if you're moving stormwater from one place to something else, it needs to get looked at. So you can look at my written comment. Just thanks for everything that everybody's done. It's been a great meeting tonight.
That is the final hand that I see raised. If there's anybody else who would like to speak, please raise your hand now. I don't see any more hands raised.
And thank you, Mary, for your input. And we do not have an executive session. And with that, council, we are adjourned. We'll see everybody next week.
Bye.